Humans were running from the demons while the knights fought desperately against them. An explosion shook the ground and flames rose around the battlefield. Eos, the strongest sword of the Empire, murmured while bleeding and gripping his sword that he had expected this because the enemy was the Knight of Hell, the Death Knight. Fire burned around them when the Death Knight declared with twisted joy that he had finally brought down Powen, the cursed empire, with his own hands. He felt that revenge became sweeter with time, and he had waited 1,000 years for this moment. He asked if anyone could understand the depth of his joy. When he turned his head, he revealed that he was Archlich Dorgo. Howard Adele Light, the Emperor of the Helios Empire, shouted in rage and demanded how he dared to slaughter all his people. He called him a filthy demon and claimed he belonged in hell. Archlich Dorgo asked calmly if the Emperor had finished talking and wondered if he may proceed with the coronation. Howard shouted again, asking what nonsense that was, and rejected the idea of a coronation for someone like him. Archlich Dorgo posed proudly and explained that he had become the first in history to unify the continent, so it was only right to be called emperor. Howard clenched his teeth in frustration. Dorgo then turned to his demon lords and praised them for their work. He raised his hand and commanded them to bring him the imperial crown. A knight controlled by Dorgo stepped forward holding the crown. Dorgo addressed him as his most loyal knight, and said no one had done more to bring him to this throne. He wondered how he should reward such merit, then answered himself by saying the knight was his slave, and that surviving him was the highest honor. But suddenly the crown began to float in the air and countless slashes shook the ground. Dorgo quickly created a shield to protect himself. He thought with confusion that he had been on guard and had not given any order for this to happen. The knight said he could finally move by his own will. Dorgo demanded to know how he was speaking because he had erased his consciousness. The knight explained that it only looked that way and he had never been fully gone. He had been trapped inside the body and had seen everything. Archlich Dorgo claimed that it was impossible and called the knight his finest creation. He said he would allow him to release his anger just for that moment until he found a way to take control again. The demons rushed forward, but the knight raised his sword and the pressure shook the ground, throwing the demons away. Dorgo watched in shock as the knight defeated all his demon lords in a single strike. He lifted his hands above his head and a green aura flared around him, while countless skeletons rose from the ground. Demons and skeletons charged together. A dark aura burst around the knight, and he ordered them to stop. He clenched his fist and told them to fall into despair. The demons screamed as their bodies shattered into pieces. Dorgo trembled while thinking that this could not be real. He believed he had created a monster with power strong enough to rival a god. He admitted that he understood the knight's anger, and would have felt the same. He then reminded himself that even if this body was destroyed, he had backup vessels and could transfer his soul to regain control. The knight held his sword and explained that while he was trapped inside the body, he had thought of many ways to kill Dorgo. He had created a sword art that could cut both body and soul. Dorgo refused to believe such an art existed and felt uneasy as the knight prepared to strike. The knight slashed and Dorgo barely dodged. Suddenly a portal opened in the sky and a rope wrapped around Dorgo's throat, dragging him upward until the portal snapped shut. Only his skull fell to the ground. The knight crushed it under his foot and told him to go to hell. He then fell to his knees and murmured that it was over. He said he had one last thing to do. He wished he could see his companions again even in death. He remembered their final moments and thought that he would apologize to them. With teary eyes he asked for forgiveness and drove his sword into his own body. Later Damien opened his eyes when he heard his sister calling him and asking why he was sleeping in such a place. He thought with relief that he was thankful to see her again before falling into hell. Then he looked at her with shock and asked why she looked so young. His sister laughed and told him it was sudden flattery and asked if he was trying to get her to defend him when their father became angry. She told him to trust his big sister and warned that he would catch a cold if it rained. She told him to hurry inside and walk toward the house. Damien stared at the mansion and murmured that he was sure he had destroyed it with his own hands. He looked at his hands and wondered if he was dreaming. He thought there was one way to know. He picked up a thin stem, stood in front of a large stone and struck it. The stem broke instantly and he widened his eyes. Then he smiled and said it felt right. But suddenly the stone shattered into pieces and he laughed loudly. He fell to the ground as rain began to fall. He clutched his shirt and thought with a smile that he had returned to the past. Damien's father shouted in anger and demanded to know if he had gone mad. He blamed him for getting kicked out of a tavern for causing trouble and said he had disgraced the family's honor. His brother burst through the door and yelled at him for laying his hand on the young son of Marquis Ryan Bloom. He shouted that because of Damien's actions their sister was dragged away by that scoundrel. Their mother cried and asked why he had taken a loan against the family land. His father pushed him out of the house. His sister stepped forward with a gentle smile and handed him money, telling him to take it and find happiness. Damien thought with pain that her life had been ruined because of him, and yet she still helped him. He took the sack and ran toward the exit. While running, he thought about how that day he had fled the family like a criminal and first felt guilt and shame. He fell to his knees and wondered how he had returned to the past. He had been thinking about apologizing to his family, and now he truly found himself back in time. He wondered if it was a divine miracle. He looked at his trembling hand and realized his body struggled even using a skill of that level. Shattering Wave was a technique that amplified the shock of a strike sevenfold and was known as the Castle Wall Destroyer, a skill he had learned after killing the knight. A man approached and Damien recognized him as a servant from the household. He believed his name was Victor. Damien called out to him. Victor smiled and asked why he was still outside. He said Lady Louise had told him to come inside and that the master's anger had reached its limit. Damien asked if he had done something. Victor stared at him and asked if he was truly asking because he did not know. The scene shifted to the house of Viscount Hashen. Damien's father swung his sword at him, but Damien dodged. His father shouted in anger while his mother and sister held him back. He yelled that Damien had lost his mind, that he had been kicked out of a tavern for brawling and had disgraced the family's honor. Damien realized this was the exact moment he had returned to. He thought about how long it had been since he was scolded like this and felt how much he had missed this scene. Tears slid down his cheeks and his family murmured in confusion, wondering if he was crying. Paul, his father, sheathed his sword and demanded to hear Damien's excuse. Damien said he had none. Paul crossed his arms and said of course he had none, because Damien was always pathetic and always making excuses. Damien said he knew that, but it still hurt hearing it directly. He admitted he had stained the honor of the Hashen house and that it was his fault without any excuses. Paul closed his eyes and asked if Damien thought things would end just because he said that. Damien bowed his head and said he would resolve it. He turned toward the door and said he would go and fix the mess he had made. He opened the door with a small smile and said that after fixing everything he would accept his punishment. Paul widened his eyes and murmured in disbelief, wondering if Damien had hurt his head from being beaten so badly that day. The scene shifted to the commercial city of Landwork. Victor told him they had arrived and asked if he truly planned to go inside. He explained that there were rumors about a criminal organization blocking the place and feared Damien would get into trouble. Damien told him that if he was scared he could go back first. Victor refused and said he could not run away and leave the young master behind. Damien smiled and said he only planned to apologize politely to the owner and leave. He told Victor not to worry and promised he would handle the matter cleanly. As he walked toward the house he thought about how he did not know why he had returned to the past, but he was determined not to repeat his mistakes. He planned to correct everything one step at a time starting from this place. Two men stood at the door. One asked why he had come again. The other held a dagger and reminded him they had warned him never to show his face there. Damien thought it had been a long time and he could not remember clearly, but the men looked familiar. He told them he had come to apologize for what he had done. The man with the dagger said he would pass the message to the boss and admitted he was surprised because he had heard Damien was a scoundrel from a trashy family. The other man crossed his arms and said he had heard the young lady of Damien's family was a great beauty. The man with the dagger grabbed Damien's face and said he might accept an apology if Damien introduced him to his pretty sister. Damien suddenly snatched the dagger and said that it was too hard. He had really hoped to just apologize and leave, but he had overestimated himself. He cut the man's hand. The man screamed in shock and pain. Damien said he would show them exactly what they wanted to see and reveal the kind of man the scoundrel eldest son truly was. The man shouted while raising his sword and asked if Damien even knew who they were before picking a fight. Damien said he did not care and told him to finish what he started. The man clenched his fist and yelled that no one in the city who touched Black Serpent ever got away unharmed. Damien then remembered. Black Serpent had been expanding their influence in Landwork around this time. That tavern was one of the places under their control. Back then, when he complained about their unfair overcharging, they had beaten him and humiliated him in front of everyone. He smirked and thought that maybe he had been the one who deserved an apology. The man shouted that they would not go easy on him just because he was a noble and rushed forward with his sword. Damien dodged with ease and the man fell. Damien said that killing all of them would not be enough, but he would hold back for his family's sake. Then he moved and cut him down with the dagger. He turned and looked around, thinking there were even more of them. One man asked if Damien was from a rival group and demanded to know which group he belonged to. Damien closed his eyes and said it was not like that. He had come to apologize and ended up receiving one instead. He said he had business with the owner and told them to lead him properly. The man refused and said he did not understand his nonsense. He threatened to beat Damien if he did not come quietly, and then pointed at him and shouted to attack. The men rushed him, but Damien knocked them all down in an instant. They lay defeated on the ground. Damien asked the leader if he was finished. The man raised his hands with a shaky smile and admitted he was wrong and begged for mercy. The scene shifted to the bar where people were drinking. When Damien entered with the dagger in his hand, the customers panicked and ran, shouting that a murderer had arrived. Damien looked at the empty room and thought the nuisance had been taken care of. The owner stood on the upper floor and shouted, demanding to know what the commotion was about. He clenched his teeth and asked where the guards outside had gone. He was Anderson Homie. Damien said he must be the owner and told him that if he meant the guards outside he had already handled them himself. The owner demanded to know who Damien was and why he was causing trouble in someone else's business. Damien introduced himself as Damien Haxon and said he was not there to create chaos but to receive an apology. The owner stared at him and asked what he was talking about. Damien explained that the drink prices had been outrageous, and when he complained, the owner's men had beaten him and thrown him out like a dog. He said that because of that incident he gained the reputation of a drunken troublemaker, and his family suffered greatly. The owner said he must mean his honor but claimed he did not understand because as far as he knew Baron Haxon had no honor left to lose. He mocked Damien and asked if he really expected an apology. He told Damien to stop pretending to be a noble and demanded payment for disrupting the business. Damien smirked and said he had planned to forgive the owner if he apologized nicely, but if this was how he wanted to handle it then so be it. He leapt forward thinking the man would pay dearly for his words. But a cloaked man suddenly appeared and pushed Damien back with mana. Damien landed on the ground. The owner smiled at the cloaked man and called him Sir Ted, saying his timing was perfect. Damien looked at Ted with interest and said he was surprised. Ted did not seem like someone who would work in a place like that, so Damien wondered why a knight was there. Ted's eyes widened in shock. The knights were described as men who walked the path of chivalry all their lives. Their ranks were divided by training, and the formal knights who freely used aura were said to cleave mountains with a single strike and cut city walls like paper. They were considered superhuman. The owner laughed proudly and claimed that Ted was the beloved apprentice knight of the Black Snake boss, so Damien was as good as dead. Damien realized Ted truly was an apprentice knight. He smirked and thought the faint aura he sensed earlier must have been because Ted was still inexperienced. Ted wondered with shock how Damien sensed an aura that was not even fully formed. Damien said he understood why someone like Ted worked in such a place. He believed Ted lacked talent, failed to become a formal knight, and got expelled. The owner began to ask Ted how much reward he wanted for dealing with Damien, but Ted clenched his teeth and said they would settle it later. He jumped forward with his sword and shouted that he would rip Damien's mouth apart first. Damien stepped back instantly, and the sword smashed into the ground. Damien thought that even with large movements the tip of Ted's sword never wavered. His own body was getting exhausted and reaching its limit, so he would need to increase his stamina once he returned. Ted glared at him and said he wanted to see if Damien could dodge again. He raised his sword and mana surged around him. Damien sensed it was a secret ultimate technique. As Ted rushed toward him, Damien closed his eyes and decided he should respond with a technique worthy of that attack. The scene shifted to a memory of a cloaked man slashing his sword while saying that no one told him what to do. He added that if humanity disappeared then all the fun things would vanish. He was known as the Master of the Sword of Death, the rare murderer Salmangwe. Salmangwe told Dorgo to stop wasting time and to scream if he did not want to die. Dorgo refused and Salmangwe smiled as if amused. He said Dorgo clearly did not understand words and that he now had one more person to kill. He called it a gift to show his secret technique before sending someone to the underworld. He spoke as if he could see the truth that the human body was mostly made of water once someone reached that state. He slashed his wooden sword with the secret technique named Calamity's Severing Sword and landed lightly on the ground. He said that with such a simple wooden sword he could cut people as easily as cutting water, and that Dorgo should have left when he was told. Dorgo's body was cut into 2 pieces, but Salmangwi's eyes widened when Dorgo began to regenerate. Dorgo struck with his claws and Salmangwi started to bleed. In the present, Ted lay defeated on the ground. Damien thought it had always been like this, that enemies who faced him died with disbelief on their faces. Since becoming a Death Knight, his abilities were far more powerful than he expected. He looked at his dagger, and remembered that his power allowed him to absorb all techniques and states of those he fought and make them his own. The owner became terrified and knelt with his head bowed. He apologized for insulting the honor of Baron Haxon and pointed at the chests while claiming that such treasure would surely heal Baron Damien's wounded heart. Damien said it was not enough, but he would let it slide. He told Victor to come in and take everything. Victor peeked inside, nodded, and began gathering the gold while thinking he would never have believed such swordsmanship unless he witnessed it himself. When they walked away from the bar, Victor said it was the first time he had ever seen so much treasure. The owner clenched his teeth and thought about taking everything back by going to the Black Snake boss. Before he could act, Damien slashed his dagger and cut the owner's ears. Damien said that reward was reward, but punishment had to be given. The owner screamed in pain. Damien warned him to tell Black Snake that if they ever touched his family, even slightly, he would not stay quiet. Damien and Victor walked away. Damien thought that one good act could not erase all his past mistakes, but with this new chance he would never disappoint his family again. He smiled and told Victor they should go home. Victor nodded. The scene shifted to Baron Haxon. Damien yawned and said it had been a while since he slept so soundly. Victor admitted he was jealous because he had not slept a wink the night before, worrying about what had happened. Damien reassured him that everything had turned out fine. The original objective had changed a bit, but they had been rewarded handsomely. He added that soon rumors would spread about someone making a mistake with the Baron's eldest son at a tavern and getting wrecked. Once that happened, no one would take their family lightly, and the image of the Baron's delinquent eldest son would change at least a little. Victor's eyes widened as he said that was all well, but he was worried about the Black Snake, considering what had happened to their members and even their apprentice knights. Damien told him that no matter how bold they would not dare mess with a noble family so easily. Even if they tried, he would stop them, so there was nothing to worry about. Victor nodded and admitted he could tell Damien's swordsmanship was not ordinary. He asked when Damien had learned swordsmanship. Damien said he trained here and there whenever he could. Paul, Damien's father, came running with rage, shouting his name and asking where he had been all day yesterday. He grabbed Damien by the shoulders and asked if he had caused another incident. Damien smiled and told him not to worry. He said he had gone to clean up the mess he caused and asked Victor to show them. Victor placed the sacks of coins, and his parents looked surprised. Damien told his parents he had gone back to the tavern where he was kicked out and cleared up the misunderstanding. He said there had been a mistake in the bill and the tavern owner gave him the treasure as an apology. Paul asked if he could really believe that, and Damien nodded with confidence. Marilda told Paul it seemed to be true because their son would not get such treasure anywhere else. Damien added that Victor had gone with him and could confirm it. He looked at Victor with a wink, and Victor nodded awkwardly while scratching his head. Damien asked his parents if they believed him now, and Marilda said it looked true. Victor only thought to himself that every time the young master spoke, it was a lie. Later Damien ran across a grassy field and stopped by a tree, breathing heavily. He thought he was too slow and had barely run, yet he was already out of breath. There was too much to do, but with his weak body he felt helpless. He held a mana potion and felt relieved he had managed to get one. He remembered asking what it was, and the owner had told him it was a tonic from the School of Alchemy that boosted stamina and vitality. Damien recalled that their tonics were so famous they were traded for gemstones of equal weight, and he felt lucky to have it. He stood up and drank the tonic. Mana flared around him, and he felt excitement as the effects surged through his body. He thought that if he wanted to grow stronger quickly, he first needed to build up his lacking stamina. He reminded himself that he had to return to the realm he reached in his past life. He thought of Dorgo and how the undead that man created would appear a few years later. He clenched his teeth and vowed to gain the strength to kill him before that happened. Only then could he protect his family's happiness. With that determination he closed his eyes, then started running again. He promised himself that this time he would definitely kill Dorgo. The scene shifted to the landwork Black Snake's hideout. Cedric Walker, the boss, chewed meat and said that their best mercenary was now useless, and it was a waste. A man asked what they should do about Mr. Ted and if he should be treated. Cedric told him to forget it, and just throw Ted away. The man looked confused, but Cedric explained to dump him somewhere appropriate. He said a dog that had served its purpose was no longer needed and they could hire anyone as long as they paid. Ted stood with the help of his sword and said that this was how it ended. Cedric remarked that Ted still had enough strength to move and offered to hire him again if he got treated. Ted clenched his sword with trembling hands and shouted that he did not need it. Suddenly, his legs and hands were bound by dark mana and he shouted in shock. A cloaked man asked Cedric if this could count as his first job. Cedric nodded and told him to show what he could do. Ted shouted for them to untie him, but the cloaked man murmured a spell. Dark mouths formed around Ted, frightening him. The mouths opened wide and began to chew him, leaving only his shoe on the ground. Cedric covered his nose as the cloaked man asked if he was satisfied. Cedric nodded but said he would appreciate it if things were handled cleaner next time. The man asked what the next job would be. Cedric explained that someone had harmed their organization, but he was a noble and tricky to deal with directly. He told the man to harm him in any form and that the worse it was, the more he would pay. He handed over a sack as advance payment. The man smiled and said he could be counted on. The scene shifted to Damien, who was doing sit-stands while holding weights. He smiled and thought that the potion's effects were very good. His stamina had improved noticeably in just a few days. Still, he found it strange that nothing had happened for days. He had been sure the black snake would come for him. Suddenly he heard noises and thought that the black snake fools were here. He grabbed a boy by the neck, but his eyes widened when he realized it was Abel and he quickly released him. Abel fell to the ground, holding his throat, and commented that Damien had grown stronger since they last met. He added that he had thought his neck was going to break. Damien extended his hand and apologized, saying he did not mean to hurt him. Abel turned his face and said he had not come for an apology. He had heard from their father that Damien had gone to the tavern and received an apology, but he found out a fight had actually broken out and several people were injured. He asked if Damien was lying to the family. Damien smiled and told him it was true because he had done it himself. Abel shouted that Damien could not even fight and asked if he had hired someone. Damien insisted he had done it himself. Abel shouted again, telling him to stop lying. He said Damien might be able to fool the rest of the family, but not him. He warned Damien not to cause any more trouble that could bring shame on their house, considering how much they had already cleaned up his messes. Damien patted his head and thought that Abel had always been straightforward and cared for the family more than anyone. He laughed and told Abel not to worry, promising that there would be no more trouble. Victor came running and shouted that something terrible had happened. Damien quickly opened the door and saw his parents sitting in front of a boy. The boy placed his teacup on the table and smiled, saying Damien had arrived at perfect timing. He explained that he had been telling the Viscount about what happened at the banquet hall and apologized for dropping by suddenly. Damien thought to himself that he had a feeling this would happen and realized he had already messed with the boy, Eowyn Lionloom. Eowyn reminded Damien of what had happened at the last social party. Damien remembered when Eowyn had said he did not mean anything and apologized if Damien was offended. Damien shouted that it was not enough to mock him, and that Eowyn had even made fun of his eyes. Eowyn claimed he was drunk and had never said anything like that, and then whispered in Damien's ear, asking what he would do if he had. Damien thought that back then he should have endured Eowyn's provocations. He also remembered punching Eowyn and found it strange that someone who was practically a full-fledged knight had taken the punch so easily. Damien realized what Eowyn really wanted. Eowyn smiled evilly and admitted he had admired Lady Louise for a long time. Paul asked what he was trying to say. Eowyn requested permission for a marriage between himself and Lady Louise. Damien's parents and Abel looked shocked. Damien thought sharply that Eowyn was using the same tactic again, taking advantage of the family's weakness just as he had in Damien's past life. Eowyn said that if they agreed to the marriage, the incident could be reduced to a simple family matter, and the disrespect he and his family had suffered could be overlooked. Paul said he could not allow that because Louise already had a fiancé and was in a relationship. Eowyn's expression turned cold as he asked how Paul would take responsibility for the insult he had suffered and whether the house of Viscount Haxton could handle the wrath of the Lionloom family. He told Paul to choose whether to pay the price for insulting him or to give him Louise. Paul thought that the Lion Loom family was one of the most influential noble houses in the Apple Kingdom, but he could not give his daughter to that infamous lecherous scoundrel. Then Louise arrived and said she would accept the proposal. Paul shouted in shock, asking what she was talking about. Abel told her to wait and that their parents would find a way, asking why she should take responsibility for what Eowyn had done. Louise smiled and said she was fine and would follow Sir Eowyn. Eowyn smiled back and praised her wisdom. He said he would send someone to discuss the specifics formally in the near future. He then patted Damien's shoulder and called him brother-in-law. At that moment Damien thought he had to endure it for the sake of his sister and family. Suddenly he punched Eowyn in the face. Eowyn fell to the ground, and Damien shouted that he could not take it anymore. In the past the maid ran to Damien and told him that Louise and Erwin had arrived after a long time. Damien felt happy as he ran toward the door and thought that he finally would see his sister again. But the moment he opened it his eyes widened in shock. He saw Louise on the ground being beaten by her husband Eowyn. Eowyn pulled her by the hair and shouted in anger as he insulted her family and mocked her for wanting to leave him. He clenched his fist and hit her again while she trembled in pain. Damien fell to his knees and felt deep guilt. He believed it was his fault because his sister had been taken away. His thoughts burned with anger toward Erwin Lion Loom, and he swore he would never forgive him. In the present, Eowyn collapsed when the knights rushed in after hearing the loud sound. They looked at Damien in disbelief and asked if he had struck their young master. Eowyn pushed himself up with fury and glared as he touched his face. He growled that Damien dared to hit him twice and stepped forward with his sword. He demanded again how Damien planned to solve the situation and thought that Erwin would never let Damien escape. Louise tried to stop the fight, but Damien gently blocked her path. He smiled at her and told her it was fine. Inside, he begged her not to sacrifice herself anymore for his sake. He then challenged Eowyn to a duel. If Eowyn won, Damien would obey him. But if Damien won, Eowyn would drop everything that happened until now. Damien ended with a sharp smirk and asked if Eowyn was scared of losing to him. Eowyn clenched his teeth and thought that Damien was an arrogant fool who only landed one lucky hit and was now full of himself. He felt this duel was the perfect chance to make Damien pay. While he was at it, he planned to cripple him and take Louise back. He smiled and accepted the duel. Later on the ground, Marilda worriedly asked if they should stop the fight even now. Paul held his head and said that if Damien was this confident, then he must have something planned, and if not, they could only pray for a miracle. Abel stood quietly and disagreed. He thought that there was no miracle to hope for because Erwin Lion Loom was already at the level of a proper knight, and there was no chance Damien could win. Eowyn stepped forward and asked how Damien planned to fight without a sword. Damien held up a simple fork with a calm smirk, and said it would be enough for him. Everyone stared in shock. Eowyn burst into laughter, and shouted that fear must have driven Damien mad. He tightened his grip and rushed forward without holding back. His sword slashed through the air, but Damien dodged easily. Eowyn charged again as a red aura surged around him in the shape of a lion's face. Damien slipped away from every attack. Eowyn gritted his teeth and thought in disbelief that Damien had avoided all the movements of the lion's roar sword in that split second. Damien kept a small smile. He felt that Eowyn had already lost his composure. He admitted it helped that he had trained recently, but the real reason was that he had already studied the Lion Loom sword style. Before the regression, he had fought Michael Lion Loom in a brutal battle, and compared to Michael, this Eowyn was far below. Eowyn shouted as mana flared around him, and warned Damien to see if he could dodge the next attack. Damien noted that the aura attack would be hard to avoid, and wondered what to do next. Eowyn leapt high with his sword raised, but Damien calmly decided that a sword saint technique would suit this moment best. They clashed, and bright sparks scattered as the pressure shook the ground. Damien held Eowyn's blade with only the fork and then twisted with precision. In one swift motion, he sent Eowyn's sword flying out of his grasp. Damien set the fork against Eowyn's neck, and everyone froze in shock. Eowyn fell back in disbelief while Damien looked down at him. Damien thought that after everything Eowyn had done, killing him dozens of times still would not be enough, but for his family's sake he would endure it this once. He told Eowyn that the match was clearly decided and that there were no complaints left. Then he ordered him to leave as promised. Later at the dining table, the family ate quietly until Damien stood up and thanked them for the meal. He said he would leave first for his morning training and walk toward the exit. Marilda leaned toward Paul and asked if he was not going to question Damien about what had happened the previous day. Abel spoke with disbelief and said he still could not understand how his brother, who had been as weak as him, had defeated the great Irwin Lion Loom so easily. It felt like Damien had become a different person overnight. Marilda agreed and wondered what had happened to cause such a change. Paul ended the talk and said they should act as if they knew nothing for now. When the time was right, Damien would tell them himself. In his thoughts he admitted he was dying of curiosity, but something told him to pretend he did not know. Damien was his son, yet he felt strangely afraid of him. Inside his room, Damien adjusted the sandbags on his legs for training and murmured to himself about heading out. Louise arrived before he could leave. She called his name with relief and said she was glad he had not gone yet. She hesitated as she tried to speak about yesterday. Damien bowed deeply and apologized to her. He said he had acted recklessly and put her in a difficult spot, and that he should have apologized much sooner. He promised that something like that would never happen again. Louise shouted that he was wrong. She placed her hand on his shoulder and straightened him. She told him she wanted to thank him. She confessed that she had been scared, and even though she had said she would follow Irwin, she had not truly wanted to. When he stepped forward for her, she felt both guilty and relieved. She smiled warmly and said she had really wanted to tell him those words. She thanked him with all her heart. Damien smiled softly and told his sister that he was the one who had always been grateful to her. He turned away and said it was nothing and that he would get going. Louise raised her hand to stop him and called his name. She handed him something wrapped in cloth. Damien turned his head and recognized it at once. It was their father's most treasured possession. Louise explained that their father had given it to her and said Damien should use it for training. She added that their father was not good at expressing himself, but his worry and love for Damien were greater than anyone's. He also wanted Damien to stop using a fork because a baron should not be forced into that situation. Damien looked at her and said he could see their father's feelings in her face. He unsheathed the sword and felt a warm gratitude in his chest. He thought with a small smile that he truly thanked his father. The scene shifted to the night. The guards at the gate yawned as a dark aura spread around them. A cloaked man slipped past them and entered the house. Inside, the rooms were quiet as everyone slept. Louise's door opened and the man stepped inside with a twisted smile. He looked at her and called her a beauty while he raised his hand. In his mind he noted that he had come because of a request from the Black Snake, but finding her here was an unexpected reward. Suddenly his eyes widened. Damien stood in the doorway with a cold expression and asked what he was doing. Damien stepped forward and said he had felt a strange energy in the house. He came to check and found that an intruder really was there. The cloaked man clenched his teeth and wondered why his magic had not put Damien to sleep like everyone else. He could not understand how Damien had approached without being noticed. He quickly gathered mana and fired a beam, but Damien dodged it with ease. The man demanded to know who Damien was. Damien replied that he should be the one asking that question since this was his house. The intruder then asked if he was Damien Haxon. Damien nodded and drew his sword. He told the man to explain who he was and what he had been trying to do to Louise. Before the man could answer, voices began to rise outside as the servants woke from the noise. The intruder realized he would be in trouble if too many people saw him. Dark aura wrapped around his body and he said he had no choice. He tried to vanish, but Damien shouted for him to stop. The man leapt through the window and escaped into the night. The next morning panic filled the stable. A man shouted in worry that the prize horse was dead, and he feared what the Baron would say. A boy scratched his head in confusion and said the horse had been fine the day before. Damien arrived and calmly told them not to be nervous. He only came to check something and would not blame them. He asked them to step aside for a moment. He examined the horse carefully and followed the lingering energy from the intruder. In his thoughts he confirmed that the trail from last night had led straight to the stable. The aura around the dead animal was unsettling. It was clearly dark magic. That meant the man was a dark mage. Damien noted that his family knew nothing about this and decided there was no reason to worry them yet. The cloaked man sat alone and laughed as he held a bottle filled with dark ingredients. He murmured that the foolish boss of the Black Snake had actually brought him everything he wanted. In his thoughts he said he had only claimed they were ingredients for a curse. With this much he would not need more materials for a long time. He sighed and thought he must be getting old because he had taken on cheap jobs just to earn some pocket money. The cult was tracking him, so he had no choice but to stay hidden for now. Suddenly a voice spoke behind him. Someone complained about the foul smell and said this was why old men should not live alone too long. The cloaked man turned in shock and recognized Damien. He shouted in disbelief and asked how the heir of House Haxton had found him. Damien answered calmly that he had followed the man's filthy stench. The intruder widened his eyes and said he had heard Damien picked a fight with the Black Snake, and was not just a spoiled noble. Damien replied that it was a good thing he stayed on guard. With threats like this, there was always a chance someone would break into his home. He guessed the man was one of the Black Snake's hirelings. The man openly admitted that he had been ordered to hurt Damien's family as much as possible. Damien called him pathetic for taking such a job and told him he was about to die. The man raised his hand and gathered mana. He said Damien was interesting and that he would not get bored if he captured him and kept him as a companion to torture. Damien touched the hilt of his sword and said that would not happen. He explained he had vowed in this life to avoid killing unless necessary, but there was one exception. He would never spare filthy dark mages. The man looked surprised that Damien had figured him out and asked if he was truly ordinary. He summoned magic circles and warned that if Damien escaped he would be in trouble. He fired magic toward him. Damien rushed forward and slashed through his body, cutting him clean in two. The man still smiled as his upper and lower halves slowly began to regenerate. Damien watched the pieces form together again. He thought the regeneration matched the strange power he had sensed at the mansion. The man was surprisingly skilled for someone who accepted such a low job. The dark mage fully reformed and claimed that such attacks would never work on him. Damien answered that he would simply cut him into dust and unleashed multiple sword strikes. The man admitted the attack was impressive and explained Damien's fearless attitude. But he said Damien had already lost the moment he entered the hideout. A dark aura suddenly wrapped around Damien's arms and legs. Dozens of twisted mouths opened in the air in front of him. The man revealed he had placed enchantments all over the building to protect himself from the cult's pursuit. Damien realized the danger at once. The dark mage smirked and ordered him to rot and die. He called himself a Yulan commander and laughed as the enchantments tightened their hold on Damien. Dark mana strings wrapped tightly around Damien and held him in place. The dark mage smirked and called him an arrogant fool who had rushed to his own death. He said that now the nuisance was dealt with, he could return to the woman he had seen the night before. Suddenly Damien spoke. He calmly identified the spell as a corrosion-type curse. The man froze as Damien broke through the dark strings with his bare strength. Shock filled his face as he demanded to know how Damien was unharmed and how he even understood black magic. Damien noted that the man was truly panicking. Inwardly he admitted he was surprised as well. He wondered how the authority inside him was still active. The scene shifted to the past. A towering skeleton covered in divine runes spoke as it observed the power flowing around Damien. It said that this was the authority, the power said to belong to the gods. It turned toward Damien, who knelt before it. It declared that it had given Damien the strongest body and the greatest spells, yet it still was not satisfied. It called him its Death Knight, and claimed he would become its ultimate sword and the incarnation of pure evil. The skeleton unsheathed a dagger and raised it. It announced that it would grant Damien even this power to turn him into an absolute weapon. A violent blast of energy shook the ground. The skeleton declared that this was authority. Mana wrapped around Damien, and he screamed as it tore through his body. The ground trembled again, and the skeleton finally rejoiced, claiming that it had obtained the authority of the gods at last. Back in the present, Damien looked at his own hand in shock. He recognized the power as the authority of greed that he had gained during his time as a Death Knight. He had believed it disappeared after he returned in time, yet it was still there. Before he could think further, a sharp beam struck him and threw him backward. The dark mage demanded an answer and shouted at him to explain how he had survived his magic. Damien placed his sword on his shoulder and spoke with calm confidence, as if every fighter hid a secret trump card. He thought about the man claiming to be an executive of Yulan and remembered that Yulan was a group known for assassination and black magic. The man's presence felt dangerous, and Damien knew dragging the fight longer could turn risky, so he decided to finish it quickly. The man activated his shining bracelet and released a burst of green mana. Damien noticed a massive flow of dark mana and understood that the bracelet was an artifact that stored and hid power. The man formed a huge monstrous mouth filled with eyes and sent out a devastating blast, confident that the eternal flame of hell would burn Damien even after death. But when the smoke cleared, Damien stood unharmed. He explained that the authority of greed did not erase dark mana but absorbed it completely. His eyes glowed as the power gathered inside him. The man shouted in panic, unable to understand how Damien held such overwhelming strength. Damien lifted his sword and told him it did not matter. He thought with disgust about having to rely on power given by the being he hated the most, yet he knew that defeating the opponent required the techniques of the Death Knight. Dark aura wrapped around the sword and formed an aura blade, a skill only sword masters were said to use. The man stared in shock, unable to accept it. Damien then swung his sword and the slash tore through the man's body and shattered the ground around them, ending the fight in an instant. Damien stood over the defeated man and pointed his sword as he asked if he talked before dying he would feel less pain and demanded to know where the Black Snake's hideout was. The scene shifted to the commercial city of Landwalk where Victor sat in the carriage and asked why the young master was returning. Damien smiled and told his loyal servant to simply follow him quietly. Victor noticed the sinister book in his hands and asked about it. Damien explained that it was a black magic book he recently acquired. Victor crossed his arms and said that even an ignorant man like him knew how dangerous such a book was. He suddenly sensed a strange smell just as Damien stepped out of the carriage holding a sack and announced their arrival. He handed the sack to Victor and told him there was something he must do. Victor looked inside and panicked before shouting at Damien, but Damien told him to calm down because people were watching. He said the details would come later and instructed Victor to deliver the diary and the sack to the place he mentioned so there would be no trouble afterward. They later arrived at the tower where the gang operated. Damien stepped forward and mocked how bold the gangsters were to set up their headquarters in the middle of the city. A guard asked who he was and Damien introduced himself as Damien Haxon of the Haxon Viscounty. The guard laughed at the name but then realized this was the man their boss had mentioned. Damien crossed his arms and told them to step aside because he had business with their boss. Instead, the guard fired his gun into the air and smirked as many men surrounded Damien with swords. Damien smiled and thought that they would regret this. The scene shifted to the governor of Landwalk, Sebastian Baker, who held girls on both sides and laughed happily as he thanked boss Cedric for letting them enjoy such a good time. Knight Robert placed down his glass and called for another drink. Cedric told them that their presence was an honor and that they were welcome to visit any time without feeling pressured. Sebastian then mentioned the businesses that once belonged to other groups and said it was fine for the Black Snake to take them all. He said the Black Snake should control the entire entertainment district and that he could easily suppress any issues with his authority. Robert said he felt bad because he could not help much, but Cedric praised him and said protecting the city was already a great service. Robert smiled and accepted the compliment. Sebastian added that if Cedric ever needed anything he only needed to ask. Cedric bowed his head politely, but inside he thought it would not last long. He believed that once the Black Snake completely took over the city, these fools would be the ones bowing to him. Suddenly a man burst into the room shouting. Cedric turned and asked what happened. He stepped outside and demanded the man to speak. The man whispered something in his ear and Cedric's expression changed. He clenched his teeth and wondered what the dark wizard was doing. He felt relieved that he had warned his men in advance just in case. He raised his hand and told the man to leave, then thought that the enemy had walked straight into his own grave. The scene returned to the ground in front of the tower where Damien drank a mana potion and his aura burst outward. In an instant he defeated every man around him. More cloaked figures then appeared with dark aura rising around them. Cedric watched from above the battlefield. He thought he had stepped outside just in case and could not believe what he saw. How could one person do all this alone? He asked his subordinate if he was sure the man was Damien Haxon. The man nodded and said Damien had said it himself. Cedric remembered only hearing rumors that Damien was some low-life noble brat. He never imagined he could be this strong. Even the dark mage Cedric had sent must have been defeated by him. Cedric ran and thought he had to call for help. A knight raised his weapon at Damien and challenged him to block a fiery attack. Damien raised his sword and reflected the fireball. The knight looked shocked as a sudden blast shook the ground. Damien used his secret technique flow dispersal and thought it should take care of most of it. He wanted to see what kind of person the Black Snake boss was. Suddenly Damien turned his head and saw a knight throwing a punch. He dodged and felt the intense aura sting his skin. The knight said he had been wondering who was causing all the chaos and called Damien a green rookie. Damien thought even city guards were involved. Sebastian arrived and shouted at Damien for causing a scene in the city. He introduced himself as the governor of Landwalk and said he would punish Damien. He added that Damien had threatened the life of a businessman like Cedric, attacked his business, and injured dozens of innocent employees, which was a grave crime. Cedric smiled and thought that no matter how reckless Damien was, he would not dare harm someone protected by the governor. Damien faced the man and said he was the Black Snake boss, and he had finally found him. He smiled and thought the Black Snake must have ties with the city authorities, but his followers were like a small cult. He added that it was funny how trash like him was called a respectable businessman, and guessed the governor had terrible judgment. Sebastian shouted at Damien to shut his mouth and said if he apologized, his generous heart might reduce his sentence. Damien replied he could not apologize for something he had not done. Sebastian said he had tried to go easy because Damien was young but warned him not to blame him for what came next and called Sir Robert. Robert stepped forward and introduced himself as the city's guardian knight, demanding Damien drop his weapon and surrender. Damien was surprised the guardian knight had shown up. Robert noted that Damien's words said one thing but there was no fear in his eyes and wondered if he was bold or stupid. Damien said Robert must be confident in himself. Robert smiled and called him stupid, then attacked, but Damien blocked. Damien thought Robert was still too tough for him to fight, and he would have to hold out until someone arrived. Robert threw him to the ground, and Damien landed thinking even though he had deflected most of the attack, Robert's power was overwhelming. Robert rushed forward asking what Damien was distracted by. Suddenly, a cloaked woman appeared and both their eyes widened in surprise. Robert demanded to know who she was, and when she lowered her cloak, he realized she was a holy knight. Then Victor arrived running and happily announced that he had arrived. Cedric clenched his teeth and thought about why a paladin had appeared. He realized it meant the Holy Order had intervened. He worried that they might already know he had made a deal with the Black Magician. Victor asked Damien if he was alright. Damien said he was not alright and that he had almost died of boredom waiting for him. He added that it seemed Victor had handled the task he asked properly. Victor smiled happily and said that even if he was not good at much else, he was confident when it came to running errands. The scene shifted to a few hours earlier. In the church, knights were praying when Victor arrived holding a sack and some items. He asked if this was the branch office of the Holy Order. A priest confirmed it and asked how she could help. Victor explained that his young master had asked him to deliver the sack as quickly as possible because it contained evidence about someone who conspired with a black magician. The priest's eyes widened when she saw the notebook. She thought the faint energy from it was unmistakably black magic and recognized the crest. She snatched the sack and found the head inside. She realized it belonged to an executive of Iran named Agito. She removed her cloak and asked where the person who delivered the notebook was. In the present, she asked Damien if he was Damien Haxon. Damien confirmed that he was. She said the evidence had been delivered safely and that the Holy Order would now intervene. Damien told her to do as she wished. She closed her eyes and thanked him. Damien thought about the paladin from the Holy Order and realized everything was going according to his plan. He reflected that the Holy Order served God and showed endless mercy to common people, but when judging heretics and demons, they could burn even their own souls without hesitation. They were fanatics, and their elite enforcement unit, the Paladins, were now on his side. The girl paladin addressed the soldiers and citizens, saying the order had received a report of someone in Manhwa colluding with a wanted black magician. She announced that while they identified the individuals involved, the Holy Order would manage the city. Sebastian shouted that Manhwa was an autonomous city and the order could not bypass him, the Governor General. The paladin said judging heretics was the will of God and that the authority of the order stood above the kingdom. She also warned that Sebastian and the Guardian Knights were prime suspects. Sebastian and the others were shocked. He asked why they would be suspected of colluding with a black magician. The paladin pointed to Cedric, saying he had hidden and supported a black magician, and that protecting such a person was enough to arouse suspicion. Sebastian shouted at Cedric asking if it was true. Cedric denied it loudly, calling it slander. The paladin closed her eyes and showed a notebook, saying the evidence was there. She explained that the notebook listed all the items Cedric procured for the black magician and the places of purchase, which could be confirmed by cross-referencing with the shop ledgers. Cedric clenched his teeth and cursed the black magician, wondering why he would write such a thing down. He shouted that it was a misunderstanding and that he had never been involved with a black magician. The paladin said that would be revealed during the investigation and ordered them taken away. The Holy Knights arrested Cedric and Sebastian as they resisted and shouted. Sebastian thought with rage while looking at Damien that he could not believe the fool had planned this from the start. He feared what would happen if captured by these fanatics. Cedric shouted at Sir Robert, asking if he was really going to surrender, warning that the knights were evil enough to frame people for crimes they did not commit. Robert smiled and agreed that being dragged away would only make him another dead dog. He rushed forward, aura flaring, raised his weapon, and attacked the girl knight, but she dodged. She punched him hard, making him scream as his aura shook the ground. Her fist passed through his body, and she said that anyone who interfered with the work of God, no matter who they were, would be judged. Robert fell to the ground as she declared they would be judged by the will of God. Victor said that he was the one they called the infamous boss of the Black Snake. Damien replied while crossing his arms that it was true and he did not look like much. Cedric thought with clenched teeth that it was pathetic to end up like this because of a brat like him. Damien said that thanks to him the situation was resolved cleanly, and he thought that the woman was stronger than he expected. He judged from her divine power that she was a disciple of the Azure Flame. The Azure Flame Brigandine was one of the 5 great saints, and was known for striking down many heretics. The night girl walked toward him and said that Damien Haxon had made a great contribution by killing an executive of Iran. Damien answered that he only did what was necessary. She said that in recognition of his contribution she would not hold him responsible for his sins. Damien smiled and said he did not know what she meant. She accused him of calling the order to cover up the fact that he had attacked the Black Snake. Damien bowed his head and apologized. He said the Dark Wizard had cursed their domain and tried to harm his family. She widened her eyes and said that under such circumstances she could no longer hold him accountable. She added that the bounty for Agito would be paid soon, which was 1,000 gold. Victor became happy, but Damien asked if he could receive something else instead of the bounty. Victor thought that the young master always threw away wealth and wondered how he could refuse this. She said it was possible and asked what he wanted. Damien raised his hand and said he wished to receive one of the mana cultivation methods that the order possessed. She asked why a man skilled enough to destroy the Black Snake alone would need a mana cultivation method. Damien thought about his fight with the Dark Wizard and realized he had only won because of his authority. To face stronger enemies in the future and rise higher, he needed a proper cultivation method. He said he had only learned a basic method and wanted to learn a higher level one. She said was surprised that he reached this level with only a basic method. She felt a strong aura from him and thought his talent was remarkable. She also saw that he had the resolve to strike down a heretic without hesitation. She smiled and said there was a better option than simply giving him a cultivation method. She asked joyfully if he would like to become a holy knight. Damien refused. She looked shocked and asked why. She said a holy knight received the grace of God and punished evil, and that it was the most glorious and difficult position to gain. Damien crossed his arms and thought that he had no faith at all and did not want to become the Order's hunting dog. He decided to make up an excuse. He placed his hand on his chest and said he was unworthy of God's love and that he wished to wander the world as a simple believer. Victor smiled and thought the young master could not expect such an obvious lie to work again. However, she looked at Damien with sparkling eyes and said his holy words had opened her ears. Victor stared in shock and wondered if it had actually worked. She said that she would give him a mana cultivation method instead of the bounty, as he requested. She added that if he ever changed his mind he could visit the Order any time, and she would greet him herself. She then said she had one more thing to ask. She introduced herself as Agnes, the first disciple of the Azure Flame. Damien replied that it was an honor to meet her, and asked if he could finish his business. She allowed him to do as he wished but asked what business he meant. Cedric shouted when Damien walked toward him and tried to insult him, but Damien kicked him and made him fall to his knees. Damien said his stomach was so full of fat it felt soft, and kicked him again before throwing him aside. He let out a relieved sigh and said he felt better. Victor asked if everything was truly over now. Damien smiled and said probably. The scene shifted to the Lion Bloom Marquisate. The Marquis of the Apple Kingdom, Holland Lion Bloom, burst into the room. Eowyn trembled and called him father. Holland walked to him and asked through clenched teeth what was going on. Eowyn said while shaking that the fool tried to kill him and had put a knife or maybe a fork to his neck. Holland turned to the knights and demanded to know who dared do this. A knight said it was Damien of the Haxon barony. Holland's eyes widened. He smashed decorations in anger and shouted that a mere Haxon dared touch his son and must have used tricks. He ordered his men to go to the barony at once and dragged Damien back like a dog. The scene shifted as Agnes bowed before Baron Haxon and introduced herself as a holy knight from the order. Damien's parents greeted her politely. Paul grit his teeth and thought that not only had Damien caused trouble in secret, but now he had brought zealots into their home. He said he had heard from Damien that she would be staying for a while. Agnes nodded. Paul explained that the house was small and he wasn't sure he could offer a proper room. She handed him a sack of coins and said it was a small token of sincerity. Paul bowed and told her to treat the house like her own and rest comfortably. Agnes stepped toward Damien and thanked him for allowing the investigation team to operate. Damien nodded and thought he did not expect it to mean she would come to their house. She then asked if she could look into something else besides the investigation. Damien looked surprised. She handed him 2 books and said they were the mana training methods he had requested and that they were specially chosen. Damien asked why she had given him 2 volumes. She said one was a sword technique and that she added it so the set would be complete. Damien thought that he did not really need swordsmanship, but there was no harm in taking it. The techniques and training methods were unfamiliar even from his previous life. Agnes closed her eyes and said it had been difficult to bring them. He thanked her. She insisted it truly had been difficult, and that there had been strong opposition in the order. She said she had even needed to borrow the authority of her master. When she told her master about Damien, he had said Damien was a chosen one and essential to the order. She held his hand and again asked if he would consider becoming a holy knight. Damien pulled his hand away and apologized. She smiled and said pushing further would be rude but told him to come find her if he ever changed his mind. She then walked away. Damien thought that, as expected, her obsession was quite strong. The scene shifted to the mages. A junior mage held his nose and said it all felt suspicious. He asked who Agito really was and wondered how a high-ranking black magician who had escaped the order many times could die to a rural noble. He said Agito was from the cursed school and weaker in combat, but even then it did not make sense. The senior mage sighed and said he had similar thoughts, especially since Lady Agnes said nothing. The junior mage asked if they should still make a suggestion. The senior said they should finish the investigation first and focus on their work. Agnes arrived and said they could trust Damien Haxon. She understood their doubts but said he had not lied. The junior mage asked how he killed Agito because he could not understand it. Agnes asked if he had not already heard the explanation. The junior said with surprise that he heard Damien just dodged roughly and killed him. Agnes said that when she first saw Agito's head she also doubted him. She remembered watching him at the scene. Alone against dozens of people, he did not receive a single scratch and instead overwhelmed them. She said the most shocking thing was that he let a magical fireball pass by him as if it meant nothing. The mages were shocked when she said it was possible. She explained that a sword master level expert could withstand any attack, even magic. She was not saying Damien was a sword master, but he was clearly very skilled. She said she had come mainly to track Iran, but she also wanted to bring Damien to her master because he could become a great asset to the order. She told them to put aside suspicion and continue the investigation. They nodded. The scene shifted to the knights riding horses. Apprentice Knight Alphys yawned and said they had finally arrived. Lavender held his nose and complained about the strong smell. Alphys called him a city bumpkin and said it was just cow dung. Lavender complained about not having perfume. Garrick, a formal knight, told them to be quiet and asked what mission the Marquis had given them. Alphys said they were told to arrest Damien Haxon. Garrick said catching him would be easy, but that alone would not repay the insults faced by the young master and the Marquis family. He then saw an old man nearby and asked if he was a subject of Baron Haxon. The old man said yes and asked what the matter was. Garrick cut him down instantly and sheathed his sword. He said the man had sinned by seeing the lion bloom crest and not bowing. He then said he had a good idea. When they reached the Haxon barony, they would tear Damien apart and slaughter everything in sight. Victor was shocked. The scene shifted back to the investigation site. The senior mage said the collapse of the area left far less information than he expected. Agnes told them it was all right and that they had worked hard. But then all of them stopped and stared. Damien sat cross-legged with his eyes closed while a strong aura flared around him. Agnes widened her eyes and thought she was witnessing the force convergence technique she had given him. It was an energy cultivation method that absorbed surrounding mana at its highest stage. She wondered how he could reach this level in only a few hours. Damien opened his eyes and stood up. He asked if the investigation was complete. Agnes nodded and said it seemed he had achieved something great. Damien held a notebook and said it was only a small accomplishment. He thought about how difficult the technique had been to obtain, and how swordsmanship mattered little to him since he had reached sword master level in his past life. But the force convergence technique was extremely useful. It was created to make up for the mana consumption of the Periok sword style. It increased mana accumulation speed and could even draw in external mana. He waved his hand and said it was already dinner time, and they should return together. He said he would prepare things, but then his eyes widened. He sensed something and his expression turned sharp. He said the vermin had arrived and that he had something urgent to do. He told Agnes to return slowly, and then ran off at high speed. The senior mage watched and said he was incredibly fast. Agnes thought that for him to move that quickly with such a small amount of mana meant he controlled it with frightening precision. She wondered what his limit was and where it ended. The scene shifted as Lavender punched Victor and knocked him to the ground. He shouted while beating him, telling him that a piece of trash should obey orders and that Victor should have brought Damien instead of resisting. Victor tried to protect himself and shouted that Lavender only wanted to harm the young master. Paul ran in and shouted for them to stop. Lavender looked at him and said he must be Viscount Haxon. Paul held Victor's head and asked if he was all right, then raised his head and demanded to know the meaning of knights assaulting a commoner. Garrick said it was nothing compared to what the Haxon family had done to the Lion Bloom Marquis. He told Paul that Marquis Lion Bloom wanted Damien Haxon and that if they handed him over, no harm would come to their domain. Paul thought he had expected retaliation, but not something so barbaric. Garrick smirked inwardly, thinking that it was a lie and that once they got Damien he planned to burn everything. Paul clenched his teeth and said he could not hand over his son. Garrick asked if he was sure and said they had no choice then. He ordered his knights to destroy everything until Damien appeared. Lavender and Alphys drew their swords. Paul shouted in anger. The knights suddenly froze as they sensed something. Lavender turned his head and asked who was there, then felt his body stop moving. Damien approached and asked his father if he was all right. Paul said he was fine but Victor was hurt. Damien's eyes narrowed. He said they were lucky because Victor's sturdy body had saved him. If Victor had died unable to endure the beating, Damien might have killed all three of them on the spot. Garrett looked at him and said he must be Damien. He mocked him for challenging the Marquis' house and called him a madman. He shouted at his knights to break Damien's legs and make him kneel. Lavender and Alphys rushed at Damien, but Damien blocked Lavender easily and thought he had wanted to test the mana he gathered with the force convergence technique. He twisted Lavender's arm and Lavender screamed. Damien punched him and thought suitable opponents had appeared at the right time. Alphys charged next, but Damien kicked him away with one blow. He thought he would use his strength freely. Both knights fell defeated. Victor opened his eyes and called Damien weakly. Damien asked if he was all right. Victor raised a trembling hand and gave him a thumbs up with a faint smile. Damien smiled and thought Victor really was an interesting one. Garrick stepped forward and spoke with anger. He said that the young master Erwin must have fallen for a cowardly trick, yet no matter how much he thought about it, he could not understand how a scoundrel like Damien possessed such skill. Damien replied calmly that Garrick did not need to know anything. Garrick's expression turned cold as he claimed he finally understood and said that Damien was not Damien Haxon. Damien's face twisted in confusion as he asked what Garrick was talking about. Garrick shouted with fury and accused him of pretending. He said that a pack of wild dogs who feared the prosperity of the Marquis of Lion Bloom must have set this trap and that Damien was not the real Damien Haxon. He insisted that by defeating the young master, Damien proved he was only a stand-in sent to harm Lion Bloom's honor. His hand tightened on his sword hilt as he shouted, "How dare such insignificant people target the Marquis?" His teeth clenched from rage. Garrick thought that Damien seemed skilled but believed his luck would end. A dark surface formed beneath Garrick's feet as he prepared his technique. He waited for the moment Damien entered his range and decided he would cut him in two in the blink of an eye. He slashed first, but Damien dodged easily. Damien smiled and said it was fitting that Lion Bloom sent a formal knight this time. Garrick's eyes widened in disbelief when Damien blocked his swift sword. He said Damien got lucky and then swung again and again with full force. Damien blocked every strike with ease and smiled while calling him too slow. Then Damien rushed forward and said that it was his turn. Garrick clenched his teeth and thought that he could not see the attack coming. In the next moment Damien kicked him in the face and sent him flying across the ground. Damien said that the kick was for Victor. Garrick stood up with a trembling body and rushed forward again while using his magic technique called Swift Lion's Majestic Sword. Damien prepared to block it and said the move looked flashy but it was pointless. When their swords collided, Garrick's blade shattered into pieces and Damien's sword pierced into his shoulder. Damien followed through and slashed again, cutting Garrick's arm. Garrick screamed in agony and collapsed on the ground. Victor and Paul watched with shock in their eyes. Garrick placed his hand on his injured shoulder and cried out that it hurt and begged someone to stop the bleeding. Damien pressed his sword against Garrick's neck. Garrick shouted that he did not know who Damien was, but he admitted defeat and begged desperately for his life. Damien told him that he had already said he was Damien Haxton and mocked him for begging so late. He reminded Garrick that he had acted violently towards his family and made his already ugly servant even uglier, yet now he wanted mercy. Garrick stammered that he was wrong and said he would apologize. Damien smiled and told him he seemed confused about who he should be apologizing to. Garrick's eyes widened when he saw Paul and Victor standing behind Damien with their weapons ready. Victor smirked as he asked if the young master was still not satisfied and offered to beat Garrick a little more. Damien said it was enough because any more would kill him, then joked about slicing off a limb instead. Paul placed a firm hand on Damien's shoulder and told him that was enough. Garrick begged on his knees and called out to Sir Haxton, saying he was wrong and apologizing for all the disrespect he had shown. Paul replied with anger and asked if a single apology was enough, reminding him that if Damien had not been this strong, their territory would have been destroyed and Damien dragged to the Marquis house to be tortured. Garrick bowed his head even lower and pleaded for mercy. Damien thought quietly that he never planned to kill Garrick. If he did, relations with the house of Ryan Bloom would be ruined. He knew he could handle that house alone, but for his family's sake he could not take that risk. If he sent Garrick back freely, revenge would surely come. He wondered how to handle the situation. At that moment Agnes arrived running and asked what was happening. Damien looked at her and thought this might actually be useful. Later she said she understood the dilemma and could help. Damien asked if she had an idea. She explained that thanks to the Haxton family, they had succeeded in killing a key officer from Iran. Because of that, the Haxton family could officially be designated as an allied house. Paul thought that if that happened, their family could escape the crisis. Damien held Agnes's hand with bright eyes and asked for her help, thinking with relief that this was exactly what he wanted since it meant protection from the church. Agnes told him it was no problem at all. Damien spoke coldly to Garrick and told him that everyone had heard it, and that he should go and tell the Marquis of Ryan Bloom that the Haxton family was now under the church's protection. He warned that if they tried to use force again, they would face the church's wrath and then ordered Garrick to leave. The knights ran toward the exit. Victor turned his head with a smile and said thank you, noting that they ran away with their tails between their legs and that finally they could relax a bit. Paul said maybe, but added that to decide what to do next, they would need a family meeting. Later, they sat together in a room. Paul began the meeting and explained that the topic was how to handle the feud with the house of Ryan Bloom. Abel raised his hand and asked why they still needed to deal with the feud since they had the church's protection. Paul explained that the church could not mediate noble disputes effectively, and that the Marquis family was powerful and could crush weaker nobles in many ways. He said the realistic options were either paying them off or becoming vassals under another great noble house, and the second option seemed more likely. Agnes stepped forward with excitement and suggested one more option, which was for Damien to become a holy knight. Damien thought with exhaustion that he did not expect that from her and refused. Paul said that since Damien refused, that option was off the table. Abel stood up, shouted, and asked why Paul accepted that so easily, arguing that if Damien became a holy knight it would solve everything. He pointed at Damien and insisted he should quietly become a holy knight and take full responsibility. Paul looked at him with cold expression and told him to sit down while asking nicely since they had guests. Abel nodded and sat down. Paul said that it was true, as Abel had said, that Damien caused the conflict with the Marquis family, but he was not the only one to blame. He explained that the Marquis' second son had his eye on Louise and would not have given up peacefully even if Damien had not provoked him. J.E. trembling said that when he thought about it, Damien had actually protected Louise from the man's advances and had done what he, a powerless father, could not. He stood up, placed his hand on Damien's shoulder, and praised him for doing well and making sure their family's honor was not trampled. Damien thought he did not expect them to see it that way and lowered his head, saying it was the right thing to do. Paul said he would take care of things from now on, and promised to be a proper father just this once. A servant arrived, bowed, and informed them that someone from the Gold Pixie ducal family was here. Paul wondered what a ducal house could want with them. The servant explained that Damien had borrowed money from the Gold Pixie family using the wheat fields as collateral and that the deadline had already passed. Damien thought in surprise that they might have already sold the fields. Paul trembled with rage, grabbed Damien by the collar, and shouted at him for being a fool. Dash and Cash's Western branch manager, Orlund Maisai, greeted Damien with a smile and said it had been a while since they last met. He came because it was the repayment date Damien had promised and suggested using the family's estate as collateral to extend more credit, saying it was just a formality, and that a lowborn like him could never seize collateral from a noble. Damien asked how much he owed. Orlund raised his hand and said the 200 gold he borrowed, plus interest, came to a total of 300 gold. Damien thought in surprise that it had been so long he could not even remember why he borrowed the money, and realized they did not have that much in the family treasury. At this rate, their household would be in danger of losing everything. Orlund reminded him that if the debt was not repaid that day, the collateral land would become Dash and Cash's property. Damien asked why Orlund said earlier that the collateral was just a formality. Orlund explained that Duke Gold Pixie had ordered them to recover all debts, regardless of whether the debtor was noble or commoner, and told Damien to bring the money or admit he could not pay. Damien admitted he could not prepare the money. Orlund yawned, sat on the sofa, and said that Damien should not have borrowed in the first place. He thought to himself that he knew Damien could not pay and that while he liked the money, he truly enjoyed seeing arrogant nobles grovel in front of him. He wondered how young Master Haxon would react, imagining it gave him chills. The scene shifted to the room where Marilda told Paul to sit down and rest, warning that he would wear a hole in the floor at his pace. Louise told Abel to calm down too. Paul shouted while holding his head that he could not sit when the family might fall into ruin. Abel shouted that the fate of the household was at stake and asked how anyone could stay still. Marilda reminded them that Damien had said he would take care of it and that they should trust him and wait. Louise added that Damien had never failed when he took action before. Paul explained that it was because Damien's sword skills were exceptional and that negotiation and combat were two different matters. The scene shifted to where Damien slammed a man's head on the ground and joked that his father was going to give him an earful. Another man rushed at him with a sword, but Damien grabbed him by the neck and lifted him off the ground, saying that since he drew a weapon on a noble, it counted as self-defense. Orlund trembled in shock as Damien walked toward him and said his legs were shaking and that he could not repay the money right now. Orlund said it was fine. Damien smiled, placed his hand on Orlund's shoulder, and suggested repaying it another way. Orlund nodded while sweating. The next day, Abel, fixing his glasses, said he felt very sad. Paul asked why. Abel said it was because justice had been forced to bow to violence, and shouted in frustration. Paul told him to quit his nonsense and cheer for his brother, who was leaving on a long journey, though he thought to himself that he had no choice but still worried if the solution would work. Agnes said it was a shame that Lord Damien was leaving so soon. Damien thanked her for all her help. She said it was the least she could do, that the investigation was mostly finished, and wished his journey to be blessed. Damien thanked her again and interrupted when she suggested he might change his mind, saying he would not. He approached Victor and asked if they should get going now that the farewells were over. Victor nodded and said the luggage was already loaded. Damien sat in the carriage and remarked that it was quite spacious. Orlund greeted them and said he had ensured there would be no discomfort while Damien was away. Damien smiled, raised his finger, and told him to keep up the good attitude and serve lobster for lunch. Victor told the coachman to depart. The carriage began to move, and Damien smiled, saying that they would head to Duke Gold Pixie's estate. The scene shifted to the Gold Pixie dukedom. Victor praised the duke's mansion and said it was as expected, rumored to be the wealthiest in the kingdom. Damien smiled and said if everything went well, he would not forget what Victor had done for him. Orlund told them he had already informed the duke and that Damien could go right in. He thought with rage that the arrogant fool must have treated him like a dog while leaving his own attendant alone, and wished everything would fall apart for him. Then he said he hoped everything went well for Damien. Damien thanked him and said he would be off. Victor nodded. Inside the mansion, Duke Adam Goldpixie of the Apple Kingdom recognized Damien and mentioned he was that brat from the Baron Haxon family. Damien thanked him for recognizing him. Adam said he heard from Demishi that Damien was looking for him, and asked the reason. Damien explained that he had borrowed money from the dukedom's loan company, and the repayment date was near, but he did not have the money. He offered to repay the debt another way by defeating the Lion Loom family and giving Adam the victory. Everyone looked shocked. Adam smiled and said it seemed Damien had come after hearing the rumors. The Gold Pixie Guard Knight Jail Heinrich agreed that it seemed to be the case. Damien thought that in the Apple Kingdom, everyone had heard the rumors. Recently, a large gold mine had been discovered on the border between the Lion Bloom Marquisate and the Gold Pixie Dukedom. The two rival families were preparing a duel between low-class knights to decide ownership of the mine. Damien already knew the outcome. The duel would end in the Lion Bloom's overwhelming victory, and the Lion Bloom Marquisate would rapidly expand its power by claiming the gold mine. In contrast, the Gold Pixie Dukedom would lose influence. Damien realized that if he helped the Duke win, he could not only pay off his debt but also keep the Lion Bloom family in check. Adam called Damien a bold fellow and asked if the rumor about him defeating the Lion Bloom family's second son and crushing a major organization in Landwalk City was true. Damien admitted it was not entirely false. Adam said things were getting interesting and that he had been having a hard time finding a knight for the duel. Damien said he was the perfect candidate, as no other low-class knight could face the Lion Loom heir besides him. Adam asked if he really thought he could defeat Michael Lion Loom, known as a once-in-a-generation genius. Damien said Michael was impressive, but he would definitely win. A knight interrupted, warning Adam not to believe everything Damien said because rumors were often exaggerated. Adam agreed that might be the case. Middle-class knight Ernst Horwitz added that Lady Chelsea would surely return with a suitable candidate, as the Grand Duchess had promised to find a knight to face Michael Lion Loom. Adam said Ernst's arguments were valid. Damien thought to himself that Ernst looked like a bone an orc had chewed up and spat out, and that he was spoiling the moment. Adam raised his arms and asked what he should do with all the retainers giving their opinions. Damien realized Adam was testing him and decided to show his answer through action. He declared that they were making a huge mistake and that if they wanted to win the duel, he should be the representative. He added that whoever Grand Duchess Chelsea brought could not compare to him. Ernst challenged Damien, asking who he was to make such a claim before knowing who Chelsea would bring. Damien raised his finger and said he could block Ernst's strike to clearly show his true strength. Ernst thought with rage that this low-class punk dared to mock him and asked Adam for permission to teach Damien a lesson. Adam, finding the situation interesting, allowed it. Damien and Ernst faced each other. Victor shouted at Damien, asking what was going on, as he thought Damien was supposed to persuade the Duke. Damien said it had just turned out that way. Victor, looking at Ernst, thought that Ernst was the one in danger. Gold told Sir Horwitz to begin. Ernst slammed his spear on the ground and threatened Damien, saying he would forgive him if he knelt and begged. Damien, pretending to be sleepy, said they should hurry. Ernst said Damien was begging to be killed and flared his aura, telling him to use whatever strike he liked. Damien wondered if he had provoked too far. Ernst shouted and rushed forward to pierce Damien's face. Damien thought Ernst was a skilled middle-class knight, and prepared to block the strike. When the spear hit, Damien's sword shattered. Ernst smirked, saying Damien had fallen for it, while Damien fell back, blood pouring from his chest. Victor became shocked when Damien stayed standing. Ernst clenched his teeth and thought with disbelief that Damien had actually withstood his surprise attack. Damien turned to Adam and said with confidence that the position of representative belonged to him now. Victor rushed forward and hugged Damien with happiness, saying he had truly thought something terrible had happened. Adam clapped with excitement, and said Damien had really endured Horwitz's strike, admitting he had doubted him at first but now saw that they had found a real gem. He raised his arms and announced to everyone that Damien Haxon had proven his strength, and would be appointed as their representative. Ernst tried to protest but Adam cut him off sharply, saying he was in a good mood and did not want it ruined. Damien thought that the Duke was completely ignoring Ernst now. He knew Ernst had decent skill but the opponent was simply better. Damien admitted to himself that he was already beyond the middle class, but since only low-class knights were allowed to participate, he had faked his level convincingly enough to fool anyone. He also knew that if he had not quickly used magic to shield himself at the last second, he could have been in real danger. Adam examined Damien and said he looked like he had suffered some internal damage, so he could not ignore it. He opened a portal, pulled out a box and offered it as a gift. Inside was a balance pill, something he had purchased from the alchemy school at a high price. It was normally used by knights during training but worked well for internal injuries too. Damien held the box with gratitude and thanked him. Adam placed a hand on Damien's shoulder and said he looked forward to working with him. Damien nodded. The scene shifted to the next day. Damien walked outside and stretched his body while thinking that the elixir had worked well and his internal injuries were almost completely healed overnight. He looked around the training grounds and felt impressed by the Duke's household, deciding he would start training with their tools from that day on. A voice called out asking if he was Damien. Damien confirmed it and asked who the boy was. The boy introduced himself as Pavel Vermund and said the others were his sworn brothers, all dual knights for the upcoming match. Pavel pointed at him and said they had been training in the field yesterday, so they had missed the commotion. He claimed that if they had been there, they would have handled Damien instead of Sir Horwitz. He said the duel with Lion Loom was a matter of honor for the Duke's house and warned Damien not to drag them down. He told him to step aside and not interrupt their training. Damien turned away and thought that this worked out well since he was curious about the Duke's knights and would now get to see their skills. The knights began their training. One knight praised Pavel for seeing through his attack and blocking it with his forehead, saying he had learned something again. Pavel replied that the knight had also improved and wondered if it meant the match was a draw. Another knight rushed in and asked them to spar next because he felt restless. Pavel told him to catch his breath first. The first knight mentioned that only a month remained until the duel and with hard training they would see good results. Pavel agreed and said they would defeat Lion Loom and restore the Duke's honor. They raised their swords and shouted that they were all for one and one for all. Damien stood there observing them when Victor approached and asked if something was wrong. Damien trembled slightly and clenched his fists while saying he believed they were doomed for this duel. Victor asked why he would say that. Damien looked at the knights and said he did not think he could win with those idiots. Adam showed happiness and joked about the dignity of the high class. Jael replied that he did not mind at all. Adam told him there was no need to act polite and to be honest, but Jael said he truly meant it. The scene shifted to the previous night. Damien bowed his head and said he preferred to train alone. Adam accepted it and said he had only wanted to ask, noting that Damien had turned down training from Jael Heinrich himself. Back in the present, Adam said Damien was an amusing fellow and asked Jael what he thought of him. Jael said Damien was impressive and that using mana in an instant to block Horwitz's strike was not something just anyone could do. Adam then asked if they could really defeat Lion Loom in the duel. Jael said it was hard to say because 3 duelists would participate and the first to win 2 rounds would take the match, so Damien doing well alone did not guarantee victory. Adam agreed and walked toward the window, saying the rest of their knights must perform well too. Jael reassured him that since Sir Sebastian Vincenzo from the middle class was overseeing training, there was nothing to worry about. The scene shifted back to the day. Damien looked at the knights and thought the situation was worse than he expected. He saw that their stamina was terrible, their skills were shallow, and they relied only on flashy moves. He felt sure they would lose at this rate. He held his head and decided he had no choice but to step in. He called the 3 knights and stepped forward, saying they would spar. Pavel smirked and said Damien had guts for challenging them after seeing their skills and offered to face him first. Damien asked what he was talking about and said he wanted all 3 of them to come at him at once. The knights clenched their teeth and rushed at him with raised fists, but Damien stayed calm. In a short moment, all 3 knights lay defeated on the ground. Pavel sat up in shock and wondered what had just happened as he looked at his companions. Damien crossed his arms and asked if they were awake, calling them pathetic. Victor held his head and shouted, asking what Damien had been thinking, causing another scene. Damien replied that it was not a scene and that he had only given the Duke's knights a lesson. Pavel tried to recall what had happened and remembered all 3 of them attacking together. The scene shifted to a few minutes earlier. Damien had dodged all their attacks with ease and knocked them out with simple movements. He landed a clean hit on Pavel's neck and Pavel fell instantly. Pavel later opened his eyes wide and wondered if he had blacked out, shocked that Damien had overpowered all 3 of them so easily. He questioned what kind of monster Damien was. Damien asked them who had been training them. Pavel answered that it was the middle-class knight Sir Sebastian Vincenzo. Damien thought it was unbelievable that someone of that level had produced such weak results. He held back his irritation and instead told them to come to him for sparring every day after their training with Sir Vincenzo. Pavel scratched his head and said he worried that Sir Vincenzo might misunderstand if he found out they were being beaten up. Damien clenched his fist and told him not to worry because no matter how much he hit them, there would not be a single mark. Pavel realized with surprise that after being thrashed, None of them had even a scratch. Damien explained that he had once learned a very specific way of beating people. He remembered a man who had traveled the continent reforming criminals. People had called him the character corrector. His method had been simple. If 1 hour of beating did not work, he doubled the time. Rumors said he had once beaten someone for 512 hours. Eventually he had begun to pity the criminals he left bloodied and searched for a way to beat people without harming them. In time he reached mastery, and that mastery was called Amsamai skill. That was the same silent technique Damien had used on them now. It caused pain without leaving even a scratch. Damien crossed his arms and asked if they now understood how weak they truly were. He raised a finger and told them not to worry, as they still had a month until the duel. He promised to turn them into something usable in that time. The knights stared at him in shock. Damien then turned and said they would resume training. A man ran toward them and said he had been searching for Sir Damien. His Grace was looking for him. Damien asked what it was about. The man replied that the Grand Duchess Chelsea had returned. Chelsea knelt before her father and said it had been a while and she had returned. Ernst smiled and thought that she had come back safely. Adam noted that it had been exactly 1 month and asked if she had brought the knight she planned to enter in the duel. She nodded, and a knight stepped forward shouting his name proudly as Guillaume Blackwing, the wild beast. The other knights whispered among themselves. They recognized the name and said he was the famed free knight who had taken part in the conflict in the kingdom of Eclanant and had almost wiped out the low-class knights there. They said that among the low class, no one could match him. Adam said he had heard much about Guillaume and that people claimed he went wild like a beast on the battlefield, which was how he earned his title. Guillaume crossed his arms and said his reputation had clearly reached even the Apple Kingdom. Chelsea stood and explained that Sir Guillaume had pledged loyalty to her and agreed to participate in the duel. She raised her hand and said he would be more than enough to face Michael Lionloom. The knights murmured in agreement, saying that in reputation alone, Guillaume ranked higher, since Michael was still in the making while Guillaume was already complete. Adam said it was good news but also a bit of a headache. Chelsea asked what he meant. Adam said he had not yet introduced the one who had already become their representative for the duel, Sir Damien Haxon. Chelsea's smile faded as she asked why he would do that when she had specifically asked him to wait. Adam replied that she had asked, but he had never agreed to wait. Chelsea insisted they could simply change the representative now. Adam closed his eyes and said it was something he would need to think about. Chelsea shouted that it was an obvious decision since she had never even heard the name Damien Haxon, and it was only natural to replace him. Damien watched her and thought she was treating him like some background extra. Then he looked at Guillaume and wondered if that man was really going to be his opponent. Adam said that Guillaume might be famous, but Damien was still a knight skilled enough to withstand a blow from Horwitz. Chelsea narrowed her eyes and said he had found the perfect excuse not to acknowledge her abilities, claiming he always said one thing and did another to both her and her mother. Adam warned her to watch her tongue in front of guests. Chelsea gave a polite smile and said the fatigue from traveling must have clouded her judgment. Damien watched them and thought they clearly had deep issues. Adam waved his hand and said the decision about changing the representative would be made after consulting his retainers, and there would be no more arguing. Guillaume laughed loudly and asked if there was any point in deciding just by talking. Jael found the comment rude. Guillaume then walked up to Damien and said the strongest one should be the representative, and suggested they settle it by whoever wins. Chelsea clenched her fists and told him to stay quiet, but Guillaume ignored her. Adam admitted Guillaume was not wrong and asked Damien what he thought. Damien smirked and said he understood he was being tested again. He knew he needed to show some skill to resolve the situation. He agreed that the strongest should be the representative, and then suggested they settle it with a contest of strength rather than a fight. He also wanted to confirm something for himself. Guillaume laughed and warned him not to blame anyone if his arm got ripped off. Damien's expression turned cold and he said that in that case, he would be kind and only pull Guillaume's shoulder out. Before anyone realized what happened, Damien grabbed his collar and slammed him into the ground. Everyone stared in shock. Chelsea wondered what had just happened. Jael found it remarkable, noting that Guillaume had gone for Damien's hand first but Damien had turned that power against him with superb technique. Guillaume sat up and shouted angrily, asking how Damien dared humiliate him. Damien smiled and said Guillaume was tougher than expected and that he had truly meant to dislocate his shoulder. Guillaume gritted his teeth and grabbed the hilt of his axe, shouting that he would twist Damien to death. Chelsea called out to him, but Guillaume ignored her and rushed forward, screaming that he would shred Damien with pain. Gull used magic and green mana flared around him as he shouted for them to stop. He asked how Damien dared to swing his weapon so carelessly in front of the Duke and if he had a death wish. Damien thought that it was impressive. That much pressure from a simple aura release showed he was truly high class. Gull said that out of respect for Lady Chelsea's dignity he would overlook it once. He closed his eyes and warned that Damien would not get a second chance. Guillaume fell to his knees. Adam clapped and said there seemed to have been a bit of a commotion. Judging from what he saw, it was best for Sir Damien to remain the representative. Ernst shouted that it was not a fair match. He said Sir Guillaume had not yet recovered from his travels and that the match gave Damien a clear advantage. He also argued that Guillaume was a knight who used weapons and could not be judged bare-handed. Chelsea agreed and said proper skills should be judged through an official duel. Adam told her to stop being unreasonable. Chelsea tried to argue again and Adam clenched his fist and told her to stop showing her incompetence. Her eyes widened and she trembled as she admitted she had overstepped. Damien raised his hand with a calm smile and asked if he could speak. He said he wished to accept Lady Chelsea's proposal. Later he walked side by side with Victor. Victor said the young master should not have accepted the duel because he had nothing to lose by staying quiet. He thought Damien always caused trouble for himself. Damien looked at the workshop door and asked if this was the smithy the Duke mentioned. Victor nodded. Damien remembered the Duke's words when Adam said that if Damien truly intended to fight, he would not stop him, and that since the training sword was damaged in the fight with Horwitz, they would have a new one made at the Duke's smithy. Damien thought he could beat someone like Guillaume with a training sword, but there was no reason to refuse the Duke's generosity. They entered the shop and Victor told the owner that they had come by order of Duke Goldpixie to collect a sword for their young master. The owner said they had been informed and guided them inside. The hall was filled with many weapons and Victor admired how amazing they looked. Damien smiled, but then his eyes widened when he saw a certain sword. He wondered if it could really be that blade. The owner noticed his interest and said it was a unique blade. It had been commissioned by a knight who once served the Duke's family, but the knight had left due to urgent matters before the sword was finished, so it never reached its intended owner. Damien asked if that knight had provided resonance steel for the forging. He thought the shape resembled the favorite weapon of the sword master known as Sword Maestro. He held the sword and said he would take it. The owner asked if he still chose it even knowing what resonance steel was. Damien nodded and thought about how resonance steel repelled mana and generated waves instead of amplifying it like rare metals usually did. He asked if the sword had a name, and the owner said the knight called it the Thousand-League Sword Kienrigem. When Damien and Victor exited the shop, a girl approached and asked if he had found a weapon he liked. She bowed and introduced herself as Rebecca, a servant of Lady Chelsea. She said Chelsea wished to speak with him and asked if he would spare a moment. Damien said he doubted there was anything to discuss. Rebecca told him he never knew, and that her lady held more cards than he might expect. She said Chelsea might offer something he needed. Damien thought she was trying to persuade him and decided he had something to confirm, so he agreed and told her to lead the way. The scene shifted to a restaurant. Rebecca explained that the place was personally run by Lady Chelsea and was reservation only for nobles. For this meeting with him, she had cleared the entire place. Rebecca pointed toward a door and said Chelsea was waiting inside. Damien opened it while wondering what kind of offer she planned to make this time. His eyes widened when he saw her. Chelsea poured a drink into a glass and told him he was a little late and to take a seat beside her. Damien sat in front of her and asked why she had called him. Chelsea said he was impatient and suggested they talk after the meal was served. He told her he did not want to waste time and asked her to say it now. She said she had only one request and asked him to step down as the representative. Damien asked if she did not trust Guillaume Blackwing. She told him not to misunderstand. Once Guillaume picked up his axe, someone like Damien was nothing. She only wanted him to save his strength for the duel with the Marquis house, since it would be troublesome if he got injured in a meaningless duel. Damien thought the reasoning made some sense, but he still asked what benefit there was for him. Chelsea told him that if he gave up his spot, she would give him everything he wanted. He asked how she could know what he wanted. She raised her hand and said it was obvious what a countryside noble would desire, such as money or fame. She said it was better to be in the good graces of the future duke, and told him to go and inform her father that he was stepping down. Her aura flared as she ordered him to deliver the message. Damien lowered his head and then smiled as he refused. Chelsea shouted in confusion, unable to understand. He smirked in his thoughts. She was panicking because he was not affected by the allure scent. Allure scent was a type of black magic that created false affection and allowed the caster to manipulate the target. Because he retained his black magic knowledge from his past life, he sensed it the moment he entered the room. He noticed the enchanted incense right away. At this concentration, anyone else would have become a slave within an hour. But thanks to the power of greed, he absorbed it all. He stood up and asked what exactly did not make sense. Chelsea stuttered and begged to know why he was refusing even though she said she would give him everything he wanted. Damien walked away and said he did not need anything from her because she could not give him what he wanted in the first place. Chelsea shouted and demanded to know what he wanted so badly. He answered that he wanted his family's happiness. Her eyes widened and he told her he would be leaving, and that she should tell Guillaume Blackwing to prepare well for the duel. Chelsea gritted her teeth and said he must value his family greatly. She stood and repeated her demand for him to step down. She clenched her teeth and threatened to send people to crush the Haxon household completely if he refused. Damien grabbed her by the throat. She struggled and shouted in outrage, ordering him to let go. The knights burst into the room, calling out to their lady and accusing Damien of laying a hand on her. Damien released her and in one swift movement cut a knight's throat. The knight fell to his knees. Damien smiled and said he had only sliced lightly, and that with a potion the knight would survive. He told Chelsea that he wanted to sever her head then and there, but he would restrain himself because that would be too merciful. He said she should look forward to seeing how horrible things would become for her later, and walked out. Chelsea trembled until Rebecca rushed in and asked if she was all right. Chelsea said coldly that he dared to do this, and she swore she would kill him. She called Mustang Fury. Mustang burst in and reported for duty. Chelsea shouted at him, demanding to know why the allure scent had not worked on Damien. Mustang said he was unsure and that some people simply had strong resistance to black magic. Chelsea slapped him and demanded to know where Guillaume Blackwing was. Mustang said Guillaume was at a tavern cooling off after the day's events. Chelsea raised her hand and shouted in anger because he was drinking the night before a duel. She asked if Mustang was sure Guillaume could defeat Damien Haxon. Mustang clenched his fists and shouted that of course Guillaume could, as he was the pride of Iran and the most gifted knight in black magic he had ever seen. He asked her to be patient and promised that Iran would make sure she inherited the dukedom. Chelsea warned him to keep that promise, or she would kill them first. That night Victor slept while holding his weapons. Damien observed his sword and thought he had not expected to run into them here again. He realized Chelsea Goldpixie was connected to the black mages. The aura he had felt from Guillaume before was black magic. Damien decided it would be better to show the Duke in person tomorrow rather than explain it. The scene shifted to the battlefield where Guillaume shouted. Pavel pointed out that the man was Guillaume Blackwing, and he looked incredibly strong. Another knight asked who would win. Pavel said by reputation alone it should be Guillaume. The knight clenched his fists, hoping that meant they would be free from Damien Haxon, who had been harsh on them under the guise of training. Pavel closed his eyes and hoped Damien would lose, but thought he could not see him losing at all. Damien stood in front of Guillaume. Guillaume remarked that Damien was not running away after all. Damien stretched and said he had slept funny and his shoulders were stiff. Guillaume noted he was acting calm. Adam, sitting on a chair, reminded everyone that whoever won today would take the role of representative and expected everyone to respect the outcome. Chelsea, looking at Adam, thought he should enjoy himself while he still could because Guillaume would win the duel. Adam then declared the duel should begin. Guillaume twirled his weapon and told Damien accepting the duel was his biggest mistake. He rushed forward, claiming that was exactly why they called him the wild beast. Damien stayed calm and flicked his finger. Mana rippled and the pressure shook the ground, forcing Guillaume to drift back in surprise. Adam commented that it was a strange technique. Guillaume shouted that Damien called himself a knight, while using ridiculous trickery. Damien sent a mana circle that hit Guillaume's shoulder and then his face, causing blood to pour from his mouth. Damien raised his hand and said playtime was over, then slammed his sword into the ground. Mana shook the earth and Guillaume screamed in agony, vomiting black liquid. Adam asked why Guillaume was acting like that, and Gold thought he was foaming at the mouth. Chelsea clenched her teeth in anger. Damien told Guillaume that his true identity was revealed and called him a fake knight. Adam murmured in confusion, asking if Guillaume was a fake knight. Damien sheathed his sword and confirmed that he was. He explained that the man had enhanced his physical strength and mana through dark magic. The people around them looked shocked and murmured that such a thing should not be possible. They worried that if the church found out, the consequences would be severe and agreed that they had to get to the bottom of it. Adam asked Damien if he had known the man's identity all along. Damien bowed his head and admitted he had. He apologized for not reporting it sooner, saying he had wanted to uncover everyone involved first. Adam asked in disbelief if everyone was involved. Damien revealed that dark mages had infiltrated the ducal house and that Lady Chelsea was connected to them. Chelsea looked shocked and shouted to her father, insisting she had nothing to do with it. Adam clenched his teeth and said the circumstances made it hard to deny. He accused her of bringing filth into his house and demanded to know why the guards were just standing there. He ordered everyone tied to Lady Chelsea to be seized and thrown in the dungeon to uncover the truth. Chelsea shouted that it was a mistake and that she was innocent. As knights began to move toward her, she thought that if she were taken in now, everything would be exposed. She shouted at her subordinates to protect her. Ernst nodded and rushed toward the knights. Adam commanded Sir Gaul to place Chelsea under arrest immediately. Gaul stepped forward and told his subordinates to make way with cold expressions. Ernst widened his eyes and thought that Damien's power was high class and that they were no match for him. He shouted to Chelsea that they would hold them off and told her to run while she could. She nodded. Gaul unsheathed his sword and said it was a shame, then slashed. Chelsea bent down and screamed, covering her ears. When she looked up, she saw a knight's body sliced in two. Her eyes widened in shock and fear. She called for Sir Ernst to help her, but Gaul warned Ernst that as a mid-class knight he had contributed greatly to the ducal house and was held in high regard by Adam. He told Ernst that if he chose to protect Chelsea, he would be executed on the spot. Ernst fell to his knees, trembling, as the knights arrested Chelsea. She protested to her father, begging him to listen and insisting she had done nothing wrong. Adam shouted that it was useless and accused her of dragging the entire house through the mud, saying that even now all she cared about was saving herself. He said bringing her into the family had been the greatest mistake of his life. Chelsea's eyes widened and she shouted with tears that it was not true. Adam said he could not listen to another word and ordered the guards to gag her and take her away. She shouted as the knight covered her face and dragged her across the ground. Damien smirked. A few days later, knights were torturing a man. The man spoke weakly, saying he knew nothing more and that whenever he smelled that scent, he felt for the Archduke's daughter. Gaul closed his eyes and said that was enough, ordering the next person to be brought in. He thought that, as expected, the Archduke's daughter had used her influence within the duchy with the help of dark mages and wondered why Chelsea had done such a thing. Chelsea lay on the ground trembling. She sat up and clenched her teeth, thinking that it was because of her father that she ended up like this. She only wanted to be acknowledged and for her father to recognize her as his daughter. She wondered why he still looked at her with such cold eyes and cried. A knight brought food to her, placing a plate inside the prison. Chelsea grabbed a bun and began to eat, thinking that she could not let it end like this. No matter how humiliating, she had to survive somehow. Elsewhere, Damien walked while stretching and murmured that today's training was over. Victor told him that the Duke was looking for him. Damien's eyes widened. In a room, Adam poured a drink into a glass and offered it to Damien. Damien took a sip and said it was fine. Adam smiled, thanking him for recognizing it. He said it was not particularly expensive but it was his favorite. Adam drank and mentioned that it was angelic cheese from the Blanco region, which paired well with the wine, and encouraged Damien to try some. Damien took it and thanked him. Adam said that they had decided to accept help from the Order regarding Chelsea. Damien was surprised and said he thought Adam would conduct more investigation himself. Adam admitted he felt ashamed, especially after Damien's help, and explained that they had lost all the dark mages. They had caught all of Chelsea's close aides, but not a single one was a dark mage. He thought Damien should be informed. Damien wondered if they had all really gotten away and if he should have gotten involved after all. Adam said that to avoid misunderstanding with the Order, they had decided to leave the pursuit to them. Damien asked if Chelsea had said anything about the identities of the dark mages. Adam closed his eyes and said no. Despite severe torture, she had never spoken and had been very tough. He explained that she had not always been that way and shared her past. Chelsea's mother had been a commoner. When he was young, he had met her while hunting with the knights. She soon became pregnant with Chelsea. At first, he had denied it was possible and later felt it disgraceful that a commoner carried his blood, so he drove them away. Time passed, and he became curious about the child he had abandoned. He investigated and found that Chelsea's mother had died from the plague, but the child had survived alone. He brought her to the duchy. Adam placed his hand on his eyes and wondered why he had done that. Damien said maybe it was because she was family. Adam said perhaps that was what she had wanted, to truly become family. To gain his approval, she might have felt she had to go that far. She could have lived a normal noblewoman's life. He admitted he must have been drunk and rambling. Suddenly, a man arrived shouting for Adam. Adam asked what the commotion was. The man shouted that something terrible had happened and that Lady Chelsea had hanged herself. Adam's eyes widened. Meanwhile, in the prison, knights fell to the ground in shock as they saw Chelsea's dead body hanging from the roof. Victor walked beside Damien with an armful of laundry, and complained that the young master never sorted his clothes properly. He said Damien always mixed everything together, and never thought about the person who had to clean up. He even said the socks were always inside out. Damien barely listened because he saw Adam standing inside a nearby room. He thought that several days had passed since the death of Chelsea Goldpixie. Her death had been declared a suicide and the interrogations of everyone involved were already finished. Her actions had been judged as bringing danger to the family, so she was denied a noble burial and placed in an unmarked grave. The threat over the Goldpixie duchy seemed settled for the moment, yet Damien felt this was not truly the end. He believed those fools would definitely cause more trouble. Victor called out again with wide eyes and asked if Damien was even listening. Damien snapped back to reality, and placed an arm on his shoulder, as he told him to stop nagging. Victor asked if it looked like nagging and Damien said it did because he made a fuss over the simplest things. The scene shifted to night where Ernst drank alone in the street before sinking to the ground. He murmured the title of the Grand Duchess and slipped into a memory. In the past, Chelsea held a small crown of flowers and asked if her father would be pleased if she offered it to him. Ernst scratched his head and said he was not sure. Chelsea brightened and said her mother always told her that flowers made people happy. She added that these were the same flowers blooming in the field where her parents first met, so she believed her father would definitely be happy. Ernst smiled and nodded at her innocent hope. Ernst spoke in the present with deep sorrow and said he was sorry he could not protect her. His body trembled and he struck himself in despair as he cried that she should have died right there, and that he should have protected her. Rebecca stepped forward and called out to him, but Ernst's eyes widened with rage. He grabbed her by the throat and accused her, blaming her for what happened to the Grand Duchess. Rebecca trembled and begged him to listen, but he shouted for her to be quiet and called her a filthy dark mage who conspired with the devil. He said he would twist her neck right there. Rebecca screamed for him to help her take revenge. Ernst paused and asked what revenge she was talking about. She told him the truth behind Chelsea's death and said it was not suicide. She said Chelsea died because she could not endure the pain. Shocked, Ernst released her and she collapsed to the ground. He demanded proof. Rebecca told him to think about it and asked if Chelsea would really have had the strength to take her own life. She reminded him that Chelsea was not that weak. She said she heard from the people who handled the body that there were marks of torture everywhere, and injuries so severe that no ordinary person could have survived. She said injuries like that definitely caused her death. Ernst clenched his teeth. Rebecca continued and said the Duke had faked her suicide to hide his own crime. Ernst's eyes widened as he thought that perhaps this was wrong because the Duke he knew cared about others. Rebecca admitted she had approached Chelsea on purpose but said Chelsea always treated her warmly like a sister. She said she could not let this go. She took his hand and placed a locket in it using faint magic as she said she would take revenge on the Duke who had done this to the young lady and that she needed Ernst's help. Ernst's eyes widened and he asked with a sharp expression what he was supposed to do. After that he turned and walked away in silence. Behind Rebecca, Mustang stepped out of the shadows. He said it was fortunate their plan worked and removed his hood. He admitted he was worried the allure scent might fail because Ernst was only a middle-class knight. Rebecca held the locket tightly and said that no matter how strong someone appeared, everyone carried a weakness deep inside and once that weakness formed, the magic could take hold more easily. Mustang agreed and said Chelsea Goldpixie had been Ernst's weakness. Rebecca let out a wicked laugh and said they should keep the story vague because they did not even know who had really killed Chelsea. She said if they fabricated the idea of murder, people would lose control. She asked if they truly had to go against Damien Haxon. Mustang challenged her and asked if she planned to do nothing. He raised a finger and reminded her that the Order investigation had confirmed Damien killed the young lady. He said Damien also interfered with the mission entrusted to them, something completely unforgivable. He added that Damien still did not know who they were and that the Duke household likely believed they had already vanished. With a smirk, Mustang thought that this was the perfect chance to use the moment, and killed Damien no matter what. The scene shifted to the house where Damien sat cross-legged on the floor with mana glowing softly around him. He sensed someone approaching and rushed forward, throwing the intruder aside. Pavel trembled on his knees with clenched teeth. Damien rested his sword on Pavel's shoulder and said it was pathetic because he had told him to sneak up and land even one hit, yet he still failed. Pavel closed his eyes and apologized. Damien said the sparring for the day was over. The knights stared in confusion until Damien asked if they did not like the idea. Pavel quickly said he liked it, and wondered why Damien was not beating them like usual. Damien told them to rest because the duel with the Marquis house was in 2 days. He said there would be no more sparring and that they should use the remaining time to reflect on everything he had taught them. The knights thought in disbelief because all they remembered was getting beaten half to death. Damien sighed inwardly because he knew most of them did not understand the real purpose behind the training. He had been sparring with them not only to strengthen their bodies but for something deeper. Still, he thought one of them seemed to have figured it out. With a small smile he walked away and thought there might be something to look forward to. The scene moved to the leafy plains at Duke Goldpixie Camp. They all sat on their horses as Adam said they were a bit late. He turned his head and asked Damien how the army looked to him. Damien replied that overall they were a strong force with good gear and impressive individual skills. He added with a faint smile that the Lion Loom Lord might be a fool in many ways, but he did train his soldiers well. Gaul approached and informed Adam that a messenger from the Marquis side had arrived with a request for a meeting between the representatives before the duel. Adam grabbed the reins of his horse and said they must be feeling the pressure too, then told everyone to move. The scene shifted to the Marquis Lion Bloom camp where Holland shouted at Michael to get up because they needed to greet the Duke's side. Michael sat up slowly and complained that his father was too loud and wondered why he would wake someone who was sleeping peacefully. Holland grew angrier and asked if he understood how important his role was in the upcoming duel. Michael lay back down and said he did not care. Holland clenched his teeth and said he would fight Damien himself then. Michael sat up again and asked why that guy was even at the Duke house. Holland explained that the Duke's side had chosen Damien Haxon as their representative. Michael smiled wickedly, gripped his sword and said that was perfect. The scene moved to the meeting place where Adam scolded them for inviting someone and then arriving late. He said they lacked basic manners. Holland crossed his arms and mocked Adam for getting angry over nothing and said his narrow temper had not changed. He then greeted Gaul and joked that Gaul should abandon the Duke and join his family. Gaul cleared his throat and said he would serve Duke Goldpixie until his bones turned to dust. Holland called it a shame and said it was pearls before swine. He then turned to Damien. Adam introduced Damien as Damien Haxon. Holland's eyes widened when he realized Damien was the one who defeated his son and knights. He clenched his fist and vowed that if he ever had the chance, he would make him pay. Yet at the same time he felt a strange unease and wondered why a high-class noble like himself felt tense facing someone so low-class. He thought it might be because of the potential Damien carried. He even wondered if Damien could rival Michael. Then Michael finally arrived with a cold expression and unsheathed his sword while smirking. Holland stopped Michael by grabbing his arm and told him to halt. Michael realized he had moved without thinking. Gaul stepped forward and asked what Michael meant by drawing his sword in front of the Duke just before the duel. Adam reminded him that pointing a sword at a noble was a serious crime. Holland bowed his head slightly and said his son had acted foolishly and that it had only been bravado. Adam asked how he planned to take responsibility because such a matter could not be brushed aside. Michael felt troubled and wondered why his body reacted on its own, as if he had faced a wild beast. Adam thought this was a good chance and smiled as he said he would let it pass, even though he would have preferred to cancel the duel entirely. Holland found it strange because Adam was not usually someone who let things go so easily. Adam raised his hand and said he would instead add more conditions to the duel wager. Holland clenched his teeth and asked what conditions, then eventually agreed to all of them. He turned away and told Michael they were leaving. Michael nodded silently. Adam waved and warned them not to go too far, then said he would see them later. Damien watched and thought that Adam was impressive for taking advantage of that moment to secure conditions. Adam turned to Damien and wondered aloud why Michael had suddenly drawn his sword. Damien smiled and said he did not know. In his thoughts he noted that Michael already seemed to have awakened his sixth sense at a young age. He felt the duel would be entertaining. Holland scolded Michael afterward and asked why he had drawn his sword, saying he had just put their house in danger. Michael told his father that Damien had known he would draw his sword and still smiled calmly. His eyes sparkled as he said he had never met an opponent like that, and wondered if Damien might actually fight him on equal terms. Holland noticed the change in his son and realized Michael had finally found someone who stirred his fighting spirit. Michael then scratched his head and asked about the disadvantageous conditions he caused. Holland thought he was a fool for only thinking of that now, but told him not to worry because victory would belong to the lion looms. The scene shifted to the duel grounds where both sides stood facing each other. A man announced the start of the first match and called for the duel knights to step forward, saying the first duel was important for gaining momentum. Adam turned to Damien and asked whom they should send. A knight approached and asked to make a recommendation. He introduced himself as Sebastian Vincenzo, the mid-class knight who trained the duel knights. He said he could suggest a more suitable fighter than Damien. Damien recognized him as the one who trained Pavel and the others. He understood Sebastian was being cautious, so he would not steal his credit, and decided to give him face. Damien raised his hands and agreed to let Sebastian choose. Adam accepted the idea and asked who the first fighter would be. Sebastian smiled and announced his choice. A knight stepped forward, Fabian Vincenzo, the first duel knight of the Gold Pixie House. Sebastian looked at him with quiet pride and thought he was counting on his son. Fabian turned his head and thought that he would win this duel in style, and regain his grace's favor. Adam smiled and said that this was Sir Vincenzo's son, and he had heard his talent was exceptional. He hoped the boy would win. Damien's eyes widened when he saw the lion loom's side and watched their first duel knight Ronald step forward. Fabian shouted his name proudly and demanded Ronald's house and name. Ronald answered with calm that he was Ronald with no family name. Fabian clenched his teeth and asked if he was a commoner, shocked that someone like him dared to face a knight who had mastered the vision of House Vincenzo. Ronald called him noisy and said the Duke's knights fought with their tongues like women. Fabian rushed forward in anger and tried to show the difference in class. He swung again and again, but Ronald kept avoiding every strike with ease. Then Ronald moved once and cut Fabian's arm cleanly. Adam stared in shock and Sebastian grabbed his head in disbelief. Ronald sheathed his sword and said that difference in class was nonsense and pointed while saying he was fired. Holland watched the scene and thought that the first duel belonged to Lion Loom House. Fabian screamed in agony as his arm was taken, and Sebastian begged him to hold on a little longer. Damien watched and thought that he had expected this outcome, but it was still too much for Fabian to bear. Adam held his head in frustration and blamed the Lion Loom Knights, saying a duel was meant to be about victory or defeat, not cutting off limbs. He asked Damien what they should do since they had already lost the first duel, and wondered if Damien should step in now. Damien said that even if he won the second duel, Michael would take the field in the final one, and no one could face him. He explained that he already had someone in mind for the second duel. The scene shifted to Pavel, who stood trembling with wide eyes. Damien told him to remember the harsh training he endured while being beaten down, and assured him that he could win. The knights encouraged Pavel and shouted that they believed in him. Adam asked if Damien was truly sure about choosing Pavel, saying he had never been a remarkable knight. Damien smiled and said he had trained Pavel specifically for this moment, and that he would not fail. Pavel stepped forward with his sword shaking in his hands and wondered what he was supposed to do now that he was actually standing in the arena. Huey's selection stepped forward from the other side, pointed his sword, and demanded his name. Pavel looked at him and thought he could tell right away that the man was stronger than he was, yet he still managed to speak his own name. Huey thought that Damien would step forward, but since Pavel was fighting, he felt bored. A red aura flared around him, and he decided to finish the duel quickly and claim the win. Pavel reminded himself to stay sharp and blocked Huey's attack, though he fell to the ground from the pressure. Huey was surprised that Pavel had blocked the strike and admitted he was better than he thought. Pavel wondered if this feeling he had was a coincidence. Huey slashed again, but Pavel drifted backward and blocked the next attack. Huey was shocked that Pavel blocked even a blind strike meant to bypass his vision. Pavel realized this was why Damien had been so confident about his victory. Damien smiled, thinking that the training he had drilled into his knights had taught them Lion Bloom's signature sword style, the Lion's Guard sword. After enduring relentless training, their bodies had learned to block instinctively, and could probably defend even with their eyes closed. Pavel dodged and blocked Huey's attacks and thought that while the style was the same, Huey was too slow. He felt grateful to Damien for helping him glimpse a new level of swordsmanship, and felt that today he had surpassed himself. Finally, Pavel struck, leaving a cut on Huey's cheek. Huey fell to his knees, and Pavel pointed his sword, claiming victory. The knights cheered with excitement, and Pavel smiled, knowing Chelsea Goldpixie had won the second duel. Michael then stepped forward with a smirk, acknowledging that the final outcome would be decided between him and Damien. Damien smiled and stepped forward, saying he had been waiting for this moment and existed for it. Michael laughed, excited to face someone equal and a kindred spirit who could fight him head-on. Damien scoffed at the idea of equality. Michael unsheathed his sword and rushed forward, urging Damien not to disappoint him. A few minutes earlier at the Lion Bloom camp, Huey knelt and begged to be killed. Holland told him to stand and said he had done his best. The other knight was simply stronger, but in the end, victory belonged to them because they still had Michael. Huey bowed his head and agreed with Holland. Holland told him to go back and rest, though he thought it was strange that Huey had been stronger than the Duke's knight by 2 or 3 moves yet was completely overwhelmed, as if every strike was being anticipated. He wondered how their family's Lion Guard sword, passed down only by word of mouth, could have been read so easily. Michael, filled with excitement, told his father that he had never felt his heart race like this, and that he had finally found someone like himself. He wanted to mark Damien and dedicate victory to his father. Holland nodded and told Michael to enjoy himself fully. Michael thought back to when he first learned swordsmanship from his father. It had been thrilling and maddening, and he had wondered how many powerful warriors existed in the world. Over time, however, his excitement faded because victory had become inevitable against all knights he faced. Then Damien appeared before him, rekindling that thrill. Michael rushed at Damien, asking him not to disappoint him. Damien dodged his attack, punched Michael's hand, and threw him away. He kicked Michael hard, sending him flying, but Michael landed and rushed forward again. Damien smiled and dodged, while Michael flared a red aura and shouted that Damien was the best. A blast shook the ground, but when the dust cleared, Damien stood unharmed. Michael demanded that Damien draw his sword and make the fight more entertaining. Damien held his sword and slashed as Michael approached, shattering Michael's sword into pieces and sending him flying to the ground. Holland shouted at Michael to stand and draw his sword, but Michael trembled, thinking he must be dead. Damien approached with dark aura and asked why Michael was squatting alone, challenging the idea that they were equals. Michael realized it might have all been an illusion, and bowed his head to yield. With that, the third duel was won, and Knight Goldpixie claimed the final victory. Holland clenched his teeth with frustration as Adam laughed loudly and raised his glass. Adam invited everyone to drink and enjoy with all their heart, saying there was more than enough meat and wine for all. The knights thanked him while Holland accepted his words with a heavy heart. Adam then spoke to Marquis Lion Loom and said they might have clashed for a while, but now that everything was settled, they should forget the past and enjoy the feast. He handed the Marquis a cup and bragged that as the victor he would pour first since no one else but him had won. Holland clenched his teeth again and thought with bitterness that Michael had surrendered without even drawing his sword. He wondered if that was fortunate or unfortunate. Damien watched all of this and thought that Adam was a troublesome man. Damien understood that Adam had invited the entire household only to mock the Marquis. Adam seemed noisy on the surface, but his goal was clear. The ducal house had won the duel and the Lion Looms would not dare provoke them easily now. Yet Damien knew there was still unfinished business. Michael stepped forward holding 2 glasses and asked if he could sit with them. He smiled warmly as he poured the drink and said he respected Damien. Damien looked confused when Michael spoke with shining eyes. Michael explained that all his life he believed there was no one of his own kind, yet Damien turned out to be like him, no, far greater. Michael still did not know how it happened, but he said he felt it without crossing swords. Damien realized Michael did not know the real reason. Michael with his super sense had faced Damien inside the imaginary space he created and understood the truth. Damien was on a level far beyond his reach and Michael had felt fear of a being so vast that its scale could not be measured. That instinct had saved Michael. If he had truly fought, he would have lost far more than an arm. Michael admitted that the world was wider than he had imagined. Damien offered Michael a word of advice as he drank calmly. He told him the world was vast and that even though Michael's talent was rare, it was not unique. Michael's eyes widened when Damien added that there were at least 3 people within the Empire whose talent surpassed his. Damien warned him not to grow proud, not to think he was the greatest, and remembered how he once believed the same and paid the price against a certain man. Michael then asked if Damien lived with that thought as well. Damien replied without hesitation and said he did not. He believed he truly was the greatest. He waved his hand and warned Michael not to become conceited unless he reached Damien's level. Michael accepted his words seriously and said he would keep them in mind. Adam stepped forward with a cheerful tone and said the two of them seemed to have grown close. He said the friendship of young men was always pleasant to witness. Damien smiled and asked what brought him there. Adam apologized for interrupting and said he had finished his discussion with the Marquis. He reminded Damien of the reward he promised before the duel, to open the Marquis treasury. He added that Holland had been unwilling, so he persuaded him with something else. Holland shouted angrily and asked how Adam dared call him stingy, knowing the value of the treasury. He clenched his teeth and thought he could not forgive Damien for what he did to Owen, but he would overlook it for now. He leapt closer and gave Damien an apology for sending knights to pressure him earlier. However, he still refused to open the treasury to an outsider. He reached into his pocket and said he would instead offer one item from the treasury as both apology and reward. He opened a small box and revealed a ring infused with dimensional magic, crafted in the White Tower, capable of storing up to 100 kilograms. Damien recognized it as a spatial magic tool worth as much as a small castle. It annoyed him that it was not the full promise, but the value was enough for him to let it pass. He accepted it with thanks. Holland then said if Damien needed anything else, he should speak. The treasury would not open, but the Marquis had many fine weapons. Damien thought about the Lion Loom family being the greatest knightly house in the Apple Kingdom, which meant their collection would be excellent. He then remembered a certain item said to still be there. With a smile, he asked if he could make one more request. Holland nodded. Damien asked for a bow. Holland looked surprised and asked why he needed such a thing. Damien smiled again and said it was for his brother's wedding. The scene moved to the Gold Pixie ducal house where Adam asked Damien if he was leaving already. Adam said he had been preparing a banquet in Damien's honor, and wished he would wait at least until then. Damien replied that he had been away from home for far too long, and needed to return to his family. Adam smiled and said that if Damien had truly decided, he would not stop him, but asked if he could stay one more day. Adam said he would assign knights to escort him, since Damien might run into bandits on the road. Damien felt the escort was unnecessary but decided to accept the Duke's kindness. He bowed his head slightly and thanked Adam for everything. Later, while traveling on horseback, Victor said it was good that Damien was finally returning home and added that the trouble Damien caused had been resolved. Damien asked if Victor was trying to hide an insult. Victor denied it and complained that walking back was tiring, unlike certain people who rode horses. Damien looked at him and thought Victor had grown far too fat since leaving the Duke's house and that he would have to make him work harder once they returned. One of the knights turned and informed Damien that the sun would set soon and he would prepare camp. Damien agreed. That night, as they sat around a campfire, Victor announced that the food was roasted. Damien said they should have a bite. Victor then called the knights to join them, but the knights smiled and said they would eat separately later. Damien watched him quietly and thought back to Pavel earlier that day. Pavel had asked if he was really leaving tomorrow, and Damien had simply nodded. Pavel had stood before Damien earlier with teary eyes and a trembling smile as he held Damien's hand. He said that thanks to Damien they had opened their eyes to new horizons and even rendered great service to the Duke's house. Damien pushed his hand aside gently, and told him they had all worked hard too. Pavel clenched his fist and said they would never forget the lessons Damien gave them. He said they would continue to strive, and then he and the others bowed their heads and thanked Damien with all their heart. Damien smiled and told them they had done well. Back in the present, Victor smiled while one of the knights approached and said he would scout the area. Damien said it was unnecessary, but the knight insisted and walked away. A sudden sharp spear flew out of the darkness and pierced the scouting knight, mana swirling around the weapon as blood poured from his mouth. A cold voice mocked the escort sent by the Duke and said low-class knights like these would never stop him. He pulled back his spear and revealed himself. The other knights recognized him and shouted in shock, asking why Sir Ernst Horwitz would do such a thing. A cloaked Rebecca stepped forward and asked if there had been pests blocking his way. She released a strange scent to hypnotize the knights. Damien covered his nose and whispered that there was no choice. He apologized to Victor, then struck him on the back of the neck to knock him unconscious. Rebecca stepped closer and studied Damien with interest. She noted that a low-class knight resisting her charm incense was unusual, and said he must have a special constitution. Her voice turned cold as she said they should kill him and dissect him slowly. Their expressions were filled with darkness. Ernst finally stood before Damien and pointed his sword at him. He said he would tear Damien to pieces and lay his remains at Lady Chelsea's grave. Damien smiled and told him it was a joke. He reminded Ernst how he trembled before Lord Jael and nearly wet himself, yet now blamed Damien for what he failed to protect. Rebecca stepped forward with a cold smirk and said Damien was cruel to dig so deeply at a wounded man's heart. She asked where his calm attitude came from and wondered if he truly believed he could face all three of them alone. She said he might not understand the danger he was in. Damien replied calmly that they were black magicians of Iran, at least officer rank. Rebecca's eyes widened as she asked how he knew. Damien simply said he had good ears. Ernst released Aura and threw his spear at Damien, but it was blocked by Sebastian, who arrived right on time. Damien smiled and said they seemed to misunderstand, because he was not alone either. The scene shifted to an earlier moment in the ducal house. Adam had asked Damien for one more favor. He told him Ernst Horwitz had gone missing and still held a deep grudge because of Chelsea's death. Adam warned that Ernst might try to take revenge. He also reminded Damien that the black magicians whose plans he ruined were after him too. Adam said Lord Jael protected him, but Damien had no such shield. That was why he wanted to add a skilled man to Damien's guard. A knight then walked in through the door. Damien recognized him as Sebastian Vincenzo. Adam explained that the other middle-class knights were away on missions and Sebastian was the only one available. Adam entrusted Damien to his care. Sebastian placed his hand on his chest and promised that he would protect Damien even at the cost of his own life. Damien understood now that the Duke had already ordered Sebastian Vincenzo to follow him in secret as a hidden bodyguard. If Sebastian walked openly by his side, the black magicians might never have appeared. The so-called protection was really a plan to lure them out. Ernst greeted Sebastian with a twisted smirk. Sebastian asked why Horwitz was there, but Ernst said he would not allow anyone connected to Lady Chelsea's death to live. Sebastian replied that Chelsea had taken her own life, but Ernst shouted in rage. He said Chelsea was far too strong to die by her own hand. Dark aura burst out of him as he claimed she had been tortured to death by the Duke. He vowed to punish everyone involved. He said Damien would die first, then the ones who tortured her, and lastly the Duke himself. Sebastian asked if Ernst truly meant to kill his own lord and said he had lost his mind. Ernst then tried to tempt him, saying he would not report Sebastian if he left Damien behind. Sebastian called him arrogant and released a surge of blue mana, asking who Ernst thought he was to decide who lived or died. Damien watched with a small smile, thinking this was what a middle-class knight was expected to be. Ernst said his arrogance was justified. He claimed Sebastian had once been stronger, but that time was over. He tore his clothes aside and revealed his hardened body. Sebastian realized what he had done and shouted in anger, asking if Ernst had used black magic. Mustang stepped forward with glowing eyes and explained that Ernst received the same enhancement as Guillaume Blackwing, gaining immense strength by burning away his own life. Aura exploded around Ernst as he declared that they should witness the power he had sealed inside himself. Sebastian clenched his teeth as he sensed the overwhelming aura and wondered if Ernst had surpassed a middle-class knight. Ernst raised his spear and mocked their surprise. He told Sebastian he should have listened. He sent a high-speed mana beam toward them and repeated that if they handed Damien over, he would let them live. The blast shook the ground, dust rising everywhere. But when the smoke faded, Damien stood firm with sharp eyes. Ernst smirked at the sight. Sebastian and the others stared in shock. Sebastian said it was impressive power, but also said he would never be hit by such a simple attack. He smirked and told Damien he would handle things there. He ordered Damien to run to the ducal house and request reinforcements. Damien nodded and vanished into the forest. Rebecca shouted after him, asking where he thought he was running. Ernst shouted his name too, but Sebastian struck him and said they would settle their long conflict that day. Ernst rushed in, saying he would grant that wish. A violent blast shook the forest as they clashed. Meanwhile, Damien ran through the woods with Victor on his shoulder. Mustang and Rebecca suddenly appeared in front of him with dark magic. Mustang called him foolish and said running alone was not enough, yet Damien had even brought dead weight. Damien smiled and said the only fools were them. He said he only lured them out because he could not fight at full strength with Sebastian watching. He stretched his body and said he needed to kill them both quickly and returned to save Sebastian. Their eyes widened. Mustang clenched his teeth and asked if Damien meant to face them both alone. He called him boastful and told Rebecca to step back. She obeyed. Mustang raised his hand and magic circles formed around him. His body twisted into a monster. He introduced himself as Mustang Fury, captain of Uran, and Rebecca as the vice-captain. Damien thought he had suspected they were high-ranking, but they were larger figures than expected. He said they warped their bodies with black magic, meaning they belonged to the Frenzy sect. Mustang said Damien knew his stuff and should also know the kind of power it gave. He said the rumors about Damien had not been exaggerated. Damien clenched his fist as he judged Mustang's speed and strength. He realized that in pure physical ability Mustang was above a middle-class knight. Mustang attacked repeatedly, but Damien avoided every strike. When Mustang's fist almost reached his face, Damien finally stood firm and used a magic technique to block it. He smiled in thought, knowing his steady training combined with the Duke's elixirs had allowed him to freely wield 10,000 flow insight. He drew his sword and unleashed countless slashes, cutting Mustang's body into pieces. The monster's scattered body fell across the ground. Mustang looked shocked and wondered how a low-class knight could possess such strength. He asked if Damien had been hiding his power all along. His pieces regenerated as he said Damien truly had the skill to defeat Agito, but it was useless against him. He smirked and said this regeneration was the power of great dark magic. Damien said he had been worried the fight would end too quickly, but this worked better. He smiled as he held his sword and said now he could enjoy using his strength to its fullest. Ernst said that Sebastian looked exhausted, and he respected him for enduring for so long. Sebastian replied that he felt only shame for being pushed back by someone who used vile black magic. Ernst said that he still did not understand the situation and that his defeat was only a matter of time. He wanted to see how long Sebastian could hold out. Sebastian thought with clenched teeth that Ernst was right and that all he could do now was endure. He silently begged Damien to hurry. The scene shifted. Mustang said that Damien was even more full of bravado than he expected. He gathered mana in his mouth and formed a large mana ball, throwing it at Damien. Damien raised his sword and blocked it with ease. Mustang stared with wide eyes, unable to understand how. Damien then slashed again and cut Mustang into many pieces. Mustang fell to the ground. Damien said that Mustang's regeneration was failing because it came from dark mana and was not infinite. Mustang asked how Damien knew so much about them. Damien smiled and said it did not matter and that cutting off Mustang's head would stop him for good. Mustang shouted that Damien had been too distracted by him and called for Rebecca. Rebecca gathered mana in her hands and used her magic. A death knight appeared above Damien, but the seal on his hand glowed and dark aura wrapped around the summoned creature. Mustang's eyes widened. Damien smiled and mocked the attack, calling it a desperate move. Mustang shouted that it was the black art Uran had researched all his life, a technique that could even kill a high class if the conditions were right. Damien called them disgusting and said black magic was only a parasitic power that ate away at the soul. He said he had thought of something amusing and that he would kill them with the very power they revered. Dark aura flared around him as Damien raised his finger and formed a sphere around Mustang and Rebecca. They screamed in agony as the sphere shrank and crushed them. The sphere shattered into pieces and Damien smiled. Victor stretched his body and asked where this place was. Damien looked at him with confusion and pointed at his face. Victor touched his cheek and asked what was wrong. Then he saw the blood on his hand and fell to the ground, whispering that following the young master had finally brought him close to death. Damien told him it was only the blood of the black mages that had splattered. He rubbed his forehead and admitted he had forgotten to ask about DONGHUA before killing the Uran fools. He raised his hand and pulled in the dark mana. 2 dark orbs formed from the fluid. Damien thought that if he could not hear the truth while they lived, then he would summon their souls and make them speak. He raised his hand and ordered them to reveal everything. The scene shifted to the battlefield where Ernst had thrown Sebastian aside. Sebastian spat blood and forced himself to stand even though his body trembled. Ernst smirked and said this was the end and that he would put him at ease. Sebastian thought that if he was going to die, he would not let Ernst reach his lord. He decided he would drag Ernst down with him. Damien stepped forward and told Sebastian he had endured well. Ernst clenched his teeth and growled that he had planned to hunt Damien down anyway, and now Damien had crawled into his own grave. Damien smirked while holding the orbs and asked if Ernst was truly sure. He thought that one more step would decide who died. Ernst shouted that he did not understand Damien's confidence and charged forward, screaming for him to die. Damien only smiled and crushed the orbs in his fist. Ernst froze in shock, his body trembling as he asked how something like that was possible. Damien opened his fist and dark mana poured out of Ernst's body. Ernst screamed in agony and raised his hands, swearing he would kill Damien no matter what. Damien flicked his hand and threw Ernst away with ease. He smiled to himself, and thought that Ernst had been a fool who never knew that destroying the soul of the black mage controlling him would wipe out all the magic tied to it. Sebastian stared in disbelief and asked how this was possible. Damien clenched his fist and said the strange pulp-like result was a side effect of the black mana breaking apart. Sebastian trembled as he tried to stand and said it seemed so, but he cared more about what had happened to the black mages. Damien supported him and said they should return to the ducal manor first, and he would explain everything on the way. The scene shifted to the Gold Pixie Duchy. Adam said he had suspected this outcome, and was glad to be proven right. He thanked Sebastian for watching over Damien as he had requested. Sebastian insisted it was Damien who had saved his life. Adam smiled and bowed his head, thanking Damien for handling the black mages. Damien laughed and said he simply did what had to be done, and that their level was lower than he feared. He added that killing them must have also broken the black mana inside Horwitz. Adam said many people fail to do what is necessary, and that thanks to Damien the family had been freed from the villains who threatened them. He hoped the souls harmed by the black mages could finally rest. Damien said that since the matter was resolved, he would return home. Adam asked him to stay a little longer because someone wanted to meet him. Damien asked who it was. Agnes entered the hall and said it had been a while. Damien froze in shock while Agnes looked excited to see him. On the bright shiny day Adam and Victor hid in the bushes and watched Damien and Agnes from afar. Adam spoke with disbelief as he said it was hard to believe that the frail-looking girl was really someone from the Order. Victor replied that she was indeed connected to his young master. Adam felt uneasy and said the situation was different from what he imagined. He sensed that appearances meant nothing and that she was truly terrifying. He added that something about those two felt strangely friendly during the interrogation. Meanwhile Damien talked to Agnes, and he said he had cut off the heads of the black mages. Agnes listened and said it was a shame she could not witness it herself. She smiled and mentioned that Damien seemed to have a deep connection with black mages. Damien admitted he knew the Order was sending someone but did not expect to meet Lady Agnes again. She grew flustered and said she volunteered for the mission when she heard he was here. She then asked if he found out where the mages belonged before killing them. Damien thought that the truth would complicate things, so he chose to deflect and told her he did not know. He said their mediocre skills made him doubt they belonged to any faction. Agnes said she wondered if they were from Iran. Damien asked if she had been pursuing Iran for a while. She admitted she was after a certain black mage connected to Iran. When he asked who it was, she told him about the murderer called Corpse Play. Damien was shocked. Agnes clenched her fist as she said everyone knew the name because of one horrible incident. A noble territory had been turned into a nest of undead. When knights arrived, they saw something terrifying in the town square. In the center they found letters shaped from corpses and entrails. Those words were written in blood. Agnes covered her mouth as she said the demon had done it all just to make his name known. Damien thought that Agnes still did not explain why she was chasing Euron. A faint feeling from her bothered him, and he could not understand it. He knew something he could never tell her. He knew the real name of the man she hunted. In the distant future, that man would gain Lord Ko's trust and become a legion commander whose undead army would slaughter millions. Agnes asked him to tell her at once if he ever learned anything about the murderer. Damien agreed and stood up. He said that was all the testimony he could give and asked if they could end the questioning. Agnes smiled and agreed. He nodded and turned away, then called out toward the bushes saying it was over and he could return to his schedule. Adam stood while brushing leaves off his clothes and said he had no more reason to keep him there. He told Damien to take care on his way back. The scene moved to the Viscounty of Haxon. Louise stood outside when Abel called to her and asked why she was out again. She asked why he came and he told her he came to look for her because she disappeared. He asked if she really thought waiting outside would make their brother return. She said she would go inside after a little while. Abel asked if she was that worried. She nodded and said Damien was just a fragile boy who went alone to the duchy. Abel was shocked in his thoughts, and wondered what part of Damien was fragile. Louise worried that the knights at the duchy might throw their weight around. Abel thought that Damien was more likely to be the one doing that. Louise smiled and wished for Damien to return safely. She suddenly sensed something and saw a shadow approaching. Damien raised his hand while sitting on his horse and said with a smile that he had returned. Louise let out a soft chuckle. Paul asked with surprise if His Grace had really bought all those things. Marilda answered with a warm smile that he had given them as gifts before they left. Damien stepped forward and handed a book to his father, and said he had stopped by the ducal bookstore and bought every book they had. Paul shouted with excitement as he recognized Lady Delphino's new poetry collection and Baron Dalica's latest novel. Damien then turned to his mother and offered her gift. Marilda touched the furniture with happiness, and said the cedari wood and the rosewood table felt wonderful. Damien then brought out the next gift for his sister. Louise looked at the grand piano with sparkling eyes as she realized it was handcrafted by Master Buckley, one of His Grace's personal treasures. She hugged her little brother tightly and thanked him. Damien laughed and said the soldiers would help carry everything. He then turned toward Abel and asked why his face looked strange. Abel grumbled and asked what about it. Damien teased him with a smile and asked if he was sulking because he did not get a gift. Abel shouted that he did not care about such things. Damien lifted his hand and explained about the dark mana subspace where he could store things. He then pulled out a small item and said it was Abel's gift, made specially for him. Abel looked confused until Damien whispered that Lady Copperhead would love it if Abel gave it to her. He said his little brother wanted to get married so he should help him. Abel panicked and asked what he was talking about. Damien asked calmly if Abel did not like Lady Copperhead. Abel muttered that it did not matter because Lady Olivia Copperhead did not even know he existed. Damien reassured him with a smile and said he had a plan. He had heard at the ducal house that the Copperhead family would soon hold a duel tournament for Lady Olivia's birthday. He said Abel would enter and get close to her there. Abel asked nervously about the duel tournament because it was an event for knights to test their skills and he could not fight at all. Damien simply told him not to worry because he would fight in his place. A few days later the scene moved to the small city of Rivercross where a group of boys gathered in a busy street. One boy drank from his cup and asked if they had heard about the duel tournament at the Copperhead estate. Another boy said the prize sounded amazing and the winner might even gain Lady Olivia's favor. A third boy said she was known for her beauty and he thought about entering too. His friend laughed and told him he would only embarrass himself. The first boy then brought up the heir of Viscount Haxon's family and tried to remember his name until he finally said Damien Haxon. Another black-haired boy joined in and said there had been a lot of talk about Damien because he had beaten the lion blue mare without even drawing his sword. A boy closed his eyes proudly and said that was not the only rumor and claimed Damien was said to be as handsome as him. A woman sitting nearby laughed and asked Jackson if he heard that. Jackson smiled and said even a stray dog would laugh at such a claim. The proud boy marched toward him angrily and asked if Jackson was mocking the most handsome knight in all of Rivercross. The woman tried to calm him and said they were talking about Damien Haxon, not him. The boy refused to believe it and accused them of lying. Jackson stood up and accused the boy of flirting with his fiancée right in front of him. The boy looked shocked and said he had no idea what Jackson was talking about because they had spoken to him first. Jackson suddenly punched him and threw him aside. He glared coldly and said the fool dared to hit on Jackson Cutter's fiancée. Another knight drew his sword and shouted that the apprentices were provoking them and would not live through it. Jackson simply said they did not know who he was. The knights rushed him and demanded to know who he thought he was. Moments later all of them lay defeated across the ground. Jackson sat in front of one fallen knight and asked if he still did not know who he was. The knight cursed and Jackson punched him again. He stood up and turned to Sophia with a smirk and asked if it made any sense that Damien Haxon had become more famous than Jackson Cutter the Ogre Slayer. Sophia hugged him and said the fools simply did not recognize him because they were idiots. Inside she grit her teeth and thought that Damien had been a mere thug until recently, and now people acted like he was someone great. She wondered what kind of trick he had pulled this time. Marilda smiled softly and said it had not been long since they returned home, and it already felt sad to see them leaving again. Louise wished both Damien and Abel a safe journey. Damien nodded and told his mother and sister not to worry. Paul stepped forward and said he agreed because it was a good chance to bring honor to their family name, yet he still felt uneasy sending them so far away. He said he had heard from Damien about Abel's feelings, and if he had known earlier he would have arranged a proposal for Lady Copperhead. Abel said it was nothing. Paul reminded them that winning was good, but they must take care not to get hurt. They nodded. Paul then reminded Abel about the special favor he had asked of him. Abel fixed his glasses and said he remembered. Paul pushed them forward and wished them a safe trip. Damien waved from the carriage as they left. The scene changed to the road near Copperhead County, where the carriage rattled along the path. Victor sat with growing irritation and thought the young masters had not spoken for hours. He found the silence awkward and felt he had to break it. He raised a finger and asked Abel one question. Abel asked what he wanted to know. Victor formed a heart with his hands and asked how Abel had ended up falling for Lady Copperhead. Abel flushed and asked why he cared about such a thing. Victor said the ride was boring. Damien thought back to his past life and remembered he had known Abel like the young lady but never knew why. He smiled and said he was curious too and that the moment was perfect. He reminded Abel that he prepared a gift and was going out of his way to help, so Abel could at least answer this one thing. Abel blushed harder and said it happened 4 years ago when he attended a Western nobles' gathering with his father. Lady Olivia had been there wearing an Elise-style dress in a shade of green that matched her brown hair beautifully. He said she looked truly beautiful. Victor chewed on popcorn and said that Abel had fallen for Lady Olivia simply because she was pretty. Damien thought about his past life and remembered that Abel and Lady Olivia had been lovers, yet the Count had rejected Abel's proposal and treated their family as if they were nothing. Abel had spent the rest of his life alone and had never been in a relationship. Damien promised himself that this time he would not let that future repeat. 3 days later they arrived at Copperhead County, where the grand entrance stood busy and crowded. Victor looked around in awe and said the scale was incredible and must have cost a lot. An old man approached and asked where they were from. Victor answered that they came from the house of Viscount Haxon. The old man checked a list and asked if Damien was Sir Damien Haxon. Damien nodded and introduced Abel as his younger brother. The old man bowed and introduced himself as Connor, the head butler, then guided them inside. At the camp, Connor showed them a spacious room and told them to call if they needed anything before leaving. Damien admired the room and said the Count seemed generous. Victor pointed out that even a separate room had been prepared for him. Damien thought the Count he knew would never have done this and suspected it was all because of his rising reputation. He told them to rest while he looked around outside. Abel quickly tried to follow him and said he needed to go too. Damien told him to stay and rest. Abel refused and said he had promised their father to stop Damien if he looked like he was about to cause trouble. Damien asked if he looked like a child and told him not to worry. He turned to leave when Sophia suddenly bumped into him and fell to the ground. Jackson rushed to her side. He grabbed Damien by the collar and told him to watch where he was going. He smirked and asked if he was Damien Haxon. Sophia stood up and said it had been a while. Damien looked at both of them and asked who they were. Damien pushed Jackson's hand away and asked if they could talk after he put the weapon down. Sophia watched him and gritted her teeth while thinking what the hell and wondered why he pretended not to know them. Abel and Victor stepped outside and Abel stared at her with confusion as he said he recognized her. Damien turned his head and asked if Abel knew her. Abel answered with confusion that she was Sophia, his ex-fiancée. Damien suddenly remembered. The faces returned to him. He saw his younger self crying in the rain while shouting, "Sophia, please talk to me," as knights held him back and told him to return. Jackson looked at Sophia and asked who the man was. Sophia crossed her arms and said that he was the ex-fiancé she mentioned before. Damien asked her who Jackson was and questioned the one-sided breakup. Sophia smirked and said their grandfathers arranged it long ago and claimed it made no sense that she, Sophia Rizzle, would marry someone low-born like him. Damien, tears fell down his cheeks. Jackson stepped forward and said they should spare Sophia the embarrassment and send Damien away quietly. He warned Damien never to show his face again and told him to leave if he understood. Damien clenched his trembling fist and ran after them, but Jackson turned and beat him repeatedly. Damien fell to the ground wounded as Jackson grabbed his collar and said he tried to show mercy, but Damien still did not know his place and called him a pathetic worm. Damien remembered that it had rained that day and he had been beaten half to death before Sophia broke off the engagement. Jackson then turned to Sophia and asked if she was hurt. She said she was fine and claimed that Damien must be embarrassed about how pathetic he used to be. She said him ignoring her now only showed he was still as pitiful as ever. Jackson laughed, and said he thought Damien might have become famous and cut ties with them. He extended his hand and said it was good to see him again. Damien asked him what the act was about. Jackson claimed there was no act and that he only wanted to shake hands after so long, while secretly thinking that Damien could never be more famous than him, and that he would put him in his place. Damien accepted the handshake and Jackson smirked, but Damien lifted him and slammed him to the ground. Damien mocked him and said he could not control his strength anymore while thinking that Jackson had just given him a reason to beat him. Sophia stared in shock. Jackson staggered up and drew his sword. Damien raised his finger and reminded him that the first one to bleed would lose. A man arrived and a dark aura surrounded him as he ordered Jackson to stop. He looked at Damien and said it was incredible that the pathetic boy had grown so strong so quickly. Damien asked if the man knew him and sensed that he carried strong energy of at least mid-class. The man asked how strong Damien truly was and told Jackson that if he was done fooling around, they were leaving. Jackson shouted that Damien had hit him in the face, but the man silenced him and told him to obey. Jackson glared at Damien and thought he would regret this. Damien asked why they were leaving already and said it was no fun. The man turned and said his name was Jacques Noir and told Damien to remember it. He walked away and said they would meet again soon. Damien murmured the name and smiled while thinking things were about to get interesting. Jackson had come running and had shouted at his master asking why he had stopped him because he believed he could have handled the enemy. Jacques had grabbed him by the throat and had warned him that he had told him to stay quiet and behave and that his words were not a joke. Jackson had apologized and Jacques had released him, making him fall to the ground. Jacques had called him a fool and had told him that if he had not stopped him he would have been shredded by Damien Jackson. Jackson had been shocked and said it was impossible. Jacques had insisted it was true and said he did not know what kind of luck Damien had, but Jackson was not able to handle him. He had ordered Jackson not to fight Damien again. Jacques had reminded him that his only goal was to win the martial tournament. Jackson had trembled and asked why he had been told to enter, and why he needed to win over Lady Olivia when he was already promised to Sophia. Jacques had burst with dark mana and had silenced him. He had said he had raised a useless boy to the realm of Hierums only for him to betray him over a woman. Jackson had been terrified. Jacques had stated that victory in the tournament and a connection with Lady Olivia were important for his greatest wish. He had clenched his fist as mana flowed around it, and he had said he wanted to reach the rank of master. He had decided to investigate Count Copperhead and the other contestants, while Jackson focused only on preparing for the tournament. Jackson had agreed. Jacques had walked out of the camp. Sophia had rushed inside calling Jackson's name. She had hugged him and had asked about the marks on his neck. He had said he was fine, but inside he had clenched his teeth. He had thought that if his master had explained properly things would be easier. He had wondered what his victory in the tournament had to do with Jacques becoming a master. In his anger he had promised himself that once he reached middle-class strength he would find a way to kill Jacques. The scene shifted to the martial tournament grounds. People had murmured as they looked at Damien, saying he looked just like the rumors and that he had an unpleasant face. Victor had spoken to Damien and said he had become quite the celebrity, and that many people seemed to recognize him. Damien had laughed at this. The host of the tournament, Count Chester Copperhead, had smiled and announced that the event was held to celebrate his daughter's birthday and had thanked the esteemed guests for attending. He had explained that brave knights from the Apple Kingdom's western lands had gathered and that the winner of the tournament would gain fame across the west and throughout the realm. He had added that the victor would receive a grand prize and that the tournament would last 2 days with team and solo matches. He had said that healers were on standby for safety so the knights could fight without fear and had announced that the first match would begin in 2 hours. He had raised his hands and had said he looked forward to witnessing their valor. Damien had smiled while crossing his arms and had told Abel and Victor that he would see them out there. They had nodded. Count Chester had turned to his daughter and had reminded her that the event was arranged for her and asked if she could at least try to smile. Olivia had asked if it was really for her and said she had never asked for it and thought it was just another show of her family's prestige. Count Chester had looked frustrated but then had widened his eyes and said that even if she was not interested, others were, and that once the matches started, the crowd would be cheering. The first match had begun with a team battle called Monster Hunt. People had started shouting with excitement. Jackson had looked at Damien and had wondered why he had been placed on the same team as him. When someone in the crowd had shouted his name, He had smiled and murmured that monster hunt was perfect for him, and had thought that it would be his chance to make a name for himself. When the gates had opened, a huge monster had stepped outside. The knights had looked shocked and had started shouting, but Damien had still smiled while standing in front of the monster. The monster had raised its hand and had slammed it onto a knight. The crowd had looked shocked. Chester had gritted his teeth and had wondered what the point was if a so-called knight could die so easily. Olivia had shouted at her father asking what he had been thinking by releasing the trolls since it was supposed to be just a match. Chester had told her not to be dramatic and said it had been necessary to thin out the weaker knights to find the true winner. The crowd had cheered and motivated the other knights. Chester had looked at Jackson and said that the audience always craved a thrilling spectacle and that it was better when someone risked their life instead of staying safe. The monster had regenerated its wounds. Jackson had gritted his teeth and had thought that its regenerative power was incredible, and that his attack had done nothing. Damien had observed the scene and had realized why they had been made to sign a strange pledge before the match. He had wondered why the contract said they could not complain even if they died. The monster had raised its fists and slammed the ground. Jackson had thought that even with his skill, facing the monster alone was too much, but with allies the odds were in their favor. Many knights had rushed forward and had slashed their weapons. The monster had screamed as blood had sprayed in the air. One knight had leaped high to attack, but the monster had crushed him in its hands. Jackson had thought that it was the right time and had rushed forward to slash with his sword. Sophia had felt happy watching him. Jackson had smiled and thought that he had done it, and wondered if everyone had seen him. He had proudly raised his sword and thought that he would become the strongest knight. The monster had appeared behind him, had raised its fist, and had slammed Jackson away. Jackson had trembled and had thought that he had forgotten there was still one more threat. Damien had stepped forward and had thought that he had no choice but to play along with the monster for a while. The monster had roared loudly. Jackson had looked at Damien and had thought that he was foolish to charge the troll alone. Damien had raised his hand, used a secret technique called Myriad Flow Insight, had leaped high, and had slashed the monster with his terror-slaying sword. Abel had shouted with excitement asking if that was Damien Haxon. The other knights had begun shouting Damien's name too. Chester had also clapped and shouted. Damien had stood victorious while Jackson had clenched his teeth in rage.